Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host, the Yao Mean of Revolution. I have a World War III update and an alert. World War III alert. Before we get into that, be sure to wipe your feet. That means hit the like button. Like, share, subscribe, support the platform, y'all. Well, President Putin, the Lord of War, called Trump's bluff, humiliates NATO, humiliates the U.S., says total victory is peace. Let's get into this information. Nothing for the Nazis accepted by the Russians. Putin has decided that peace through war is the only way to go. Putin is a holy man. There's a time for peace and there's a time for war.
For the past 3 days, the attention of all the world's media and military experts has been focused on the Kursk region, where the Ukrainian army and NATO forces continue their chaotic retreat with heavy losses in manpower and equipment. Moreover, even the topic of the negotiations that began between representatives of the United States and Ukraine took a back seat amid the Russian army's rapid advance in the Kursk region. During the past 72 hours alone, the Russian army has managed to liberate 5 settlements in the Kursk region. This fact was confirmed not only by numerous war correspondents, but also by official representatives of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation. So, a few hours ago, the Russian military department officially confirmed the liberation of settlements such as Mirny, Zamostai, Toroynyazy, Pervyinayazy, and Kazakyalaknya. All these settlements are located around the city of Sudzha. As for Sudzha, numerous war correspondents have already stated that Russian troops have also completely liberated this city. As evidence, they began posting video footage online, where it is clearly visible how Russian soldiers are hoisting the Russian flag in the administrative center of the city of Sudzha. However, the Russian military department is still in no hurry to officially recognize the liberation of Sudzha. According to the Russian military, the Russian Defense Ministry will officially announce the liberation of Sudzha only after the city is completely cleared of Ukrainian soldiers and foreign mercenaries, who still continue to hide in the basements of residential buildings. They hope to escape Sudzha under the cover of night. However, most of them do not succeed. Russian drones are constantly in the air, carefully scanning all escape routes, in non-stop mode. In general, war correspondents record the retreat of Ukrainian troops not only in Sudzha, but also throughout the Kursk region. At the same time, it is reported that Russian troops are literally pursuing the retreating Ukrainian army units' heels, preventing them from quietly leaving Russian soil. According to war correspondents, in the last 24 hours alone, in the Kursk region, the retreating Ukrainian army and NATO forces have lost more than 300 soldiers and 50 pieces of heavy equipment, including 2 tanks. Commenting on what is happening in the Kursk region, numerous esteemed military analysts have opined that this military escapade, carried out by Kiev regime and its Western masters, will go down in history as the most unsuccessful military operation of the 21st century. Over the 7 months of fighting, the Ukrainian army not only failed to achieve all of its objectives in the Kursk region, but also lost all of its most experienced and battle-ready units there. According to the commander of Spetsnaz Akhmat, General Apty Yaladanov, since August 2024, in the Kursk region, Ukraine has lost almost 70,000 soldiers, and about 3,000 pieces of heavy equipment, including 400 tanks. This Russian general also noted that it was Operation Flow, during which Spetsnaz Akhmat fighters, along with soldiers from other units, infiltrated Sudzha using an underground gas pipe, which marked not only the liberation of the city, but also the entire Kursk region. Meanwhile, Ukrainian and Western propaganda, trying to justify the crushing defeat of the Ukrainian army and NATO forces in the Kursk Oblast, began to call the retreat of Ukrainian troops from this Russian region Kyiv's goodwill gesture. According to them, the Ukrainian General Staff and its NATO military advisors began to withdraw their troops from the Kursk region, allegedly because of the agreements that were reached during negotiations in Saudi Arabia between the American and Ukrainian delegations. At the same time, the Ukrainian and Western media defiantly ignore numerous videos on the internet, where on March 10, Volodymyr Zelensky and the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, General Syrsky, officially declared that the Ukrainian army will continue to hold its positions in the Kursk region at any cost, in order to use this factor as a bargaining chip with Russia during the upcoming peace talks. By the way, on March 12, it became known that the Kiev authorities fired Major General Dmitry Krasilnikov, who commanded the Ukrainian troops in the Kursk region. The dismissal of this general once again confirmed the fact that the Ukrainian army was not going to voluntarily leave the Kursk Oblast, and that the order to withdraw Ukrainian troops from this Russian region followed only after the Russians managed to break through the enemy defenses in Sudzha. According to the authoritative Telegram channel Shot, the Ukrainian command and NATO military advisors began withdrawing their troops from Sudzha 2 days before the meeting of the American and Ukrainian delegations in Saudi Arabia. It is reported that Ukrainian soldiers and foreign mercenaries, among whom there were also a large number of active duty soldiers and officers from NATO allied countries, began to flee Sudzha as soon as Russian units entered the city through an underground gas pipe. At the same time, it is reported that the flight of Ukrainian and NATO soldiers was so disorganized and chaotic that in the first hours after the Russian breakthrough, the Ukrainian army and NATO forces lost more than 100 soldiers and 20 pieces of equipment. For example, this video clearly shows the chaotic flight of Ukrainian and NATO soldiers from Sudzha. The footage clearly shows how, under the cover of night, about 40 Ukrainian and NATO soldiers are running away from the advancing Russian troops. Fleeing in a southwesterly direction, this group of enemy soldiers decided to hide in a local school building. And that was their fatal mistake. Seeing all this, the reconnaissance drone transmitted the exact coordinates of this building to the Russian gunners. And literally 3 minutes later, this building, along with Ukrainian and NATO soldiers, was completely destroyed using a guided projectile Krasnopol. Later, in the rubble of this destroyed building, the Russian military found the corpses of 35 Ukrainian and NATO soldiers. It is reported that they were mostly British and Polish citizens.
That's what they wanted, right?
Comrade officers. Please, Valery Vasilyevic, Comrade Supreme Commander-in-Chief. Units of the Northern Group of Forces continue the operation to destroy the enemy in the Kursk region of Russia. In total, during our offensive actions, more than 1,100 square kilometers of territory have been liberated, which is more than 86% of the area previously occupied by the enemy. During the military operations in the Kursk direction, the enemy lost more than 67,000 servicemen. These are the most trained, highly mobile and highly motivated units of the enemy's armed forces, as well as formations of foreign mercenaries.
A lot of Nazis.
In total, we have destroyed about 7,000 units of military equipment during this time, including 391 tanks, 2,780 combat armored vehicles, over 1,000 artillery pieces and mortars. The command of the enemy's armed forces in the autumn-winter campaign concentrated its main efforts on the Kursk direction. This is confirmed by the figures. Thus, the relatively small Kursk bridgehead of the enemy army accounts for about 19% of losses from the entire zone of military operations. This is personnel, and more than 40% of losses in equipment. If you calculate everything for 6 months, then 19% of personnel and 40% of military equipment fall in this direction. The Kiev regime aimed to create a so-called strategic bridgehead in the Kursk region for its subsequent use as a bargaining chip in possible negotiations with Russia. In addition, the Ukrainian leadership tried to use the invasion of the Kursk region in order to stop the advance of our troop groups and pull our troops out of Donbass. These plans of the enemy completely failed. The achieved results were made possible thanks to the courageous, selfless, and coordinated actions of the military units and units of Russia, as well as volunteer formations of the Northern Group of Forces, as well as the effective use of aviation of the aerospace forces and unmanned aerial vehicle units. The advance along the state border of the paratroopers of the 76th and 106th Airborne Divisions, the 83rd Airborne Assault Brigade, Marines of the 810th Marine Brigade, together with the successful actions of the Rubicon Unmanned Aerial Vehicle Unit in the border areas of the Kursk region, and on the territory of the Sumy region of Ukraine in February of this year, made it possible to take under tight fire control the remaining logistics routes of the armed forces of Ukraine, deprive the enemy of the ability to transfer reserves, deliver ammunition and material resources, and create conditions for the final defeat of the enemy. The offensive actions of the 155th Marine Brigade in the Nikolsky direction closed the encirclement of a large enemy group in the area north of Malaya Lochnia. Subsequently, the actions of the 34th Motorized Rifle Brigade, the 22nd Motorized Rifle Regiment, units of the 9th Motorized Rifle Regiment, and units of other units liberated Malaya Lochnia and the adjacent settlements. The enemy suffered heavy losses, and individual small groups of the enemy, under fire from artillery and drones on our side, began to retreat in the southern direction, losing people in the direction of movement. I would especially like to note the heroic actions of the Combined Assault Unit of the Veterans Volunteer Detachment, as well as the personnel who were part of this Combined Assault Detachment, the 11th Airborne Assault Brigade, the 30th Motorized Rifle Regiment, and the Akhmet Special Forces Detachment. The soldiers of this combined formation, numbering more than 600 people, using the gas transportation system pipe, covered a distance of about 15 kilometers inside it and emerged deep within the combat formations of the Ukrainian Armed Forces Group. These actions came as a surprise to the enemy and contributed to the collapse of its defense and the development of our offensive in the Kursk region. As a result, in the last 5 days alone, the actions of the Kursk group of troops in all directions have liberated 24 settlements and 259 square kilometers of the territory of the Kursk region. The area of the enemy's penetration has decreased more than 2.5 times. Currently, the operation to destroy the enemy on Kursk soil continues. The enemy's penetration group of armed forces is isolated and is being systematically destroyed. In some directions, Russian military units cross the state border and enter the Sumy region, where they continue to destroy enemy reserves and expand the security zone. Ukrainian servicemen, seeing the futility of further resistance, began to actively surrender. 430 militants were captured. Comrade Supreme Commander-in-Chief. Thus, the armed forces of the Russian Federation continue to defeat the enemy armed forces in the territory of the Kursk region with the task of completing the liberation of the region's territory with access to the state border of the Russian Federation in the shortest possible time. The report is finished. In this part, one would like to say the following. You have already noted some units that have shown themselves to be the best. I hear them almost every day. Lately, both in the morning and in the evening. And you have named some of them. But I still want to name those that I have heard. These are the 76th Guards Airborne Assault Division, the 106th Guards Airborne Assault Division, the 11th Guards Separate Airborne Assault Brigade, and the 83rd Guards Airborne Assault Brigade, the 56th Guards Airborne Assault Regiment of the 7th Airborne Assault Division, the 155th Guards Separate Marine Brigade of the Pacific Fleet, the 810th Marine Brigade of the Black Sea Fleet, the 177th Guards Separate Marine Regiment of the Caspian Flotilla, and the 34th Guards Motorized Rifle Brigade. They have probably been particularly active recently, in the last week. This also includes the 22nd Motorized Rifle Regiment of the 72nd Motorized Rifle Division, the 1220th Motorized Rifle Regiment of the 3rd Motorized Rifle Division, and the Akhmet Special Forces Unit that has already been mentioned here, the Veterans Volunteer Formation, which is distinguished by its particular audacity and effectiveness, and everyone who acted with them. I would also like to thank the leadership of the main operational directorate of the General Staff for the work they have done. Indeed, our task in the near future, in the shortest possible time, is to finally defeat the enemy. That has dug in on the territory of the Kursk region and is still waging military operations here. It is necessary to completely liberate the territory of the Kursk region, restore the position of our troops along the state border line. And of course, we need to think. I would ask you to think in the future about creating a security zone along the state border. We also need to think about this. This is what I would also like to draw your attention to. All those people who are on the territory of the Kursk region and who commit crimes here against the civilian population, who oppose our armed forces, law enforcement agencies and special services. In accordance with the laws of the Russian Federation, they are terrorists. The Prosecutor General's Office of Russia classifies their actions in a similar manner, and it is under these articles, terrorism, that a criminal case has been opened against them by the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation. Just now, Valery Vasilyevic mentioned prisoners. But those people who break the law, I was talking about them. Of course, first of all, we must treat as terrorists in accordance with the laws of the Russian Federation. We treat all people and must treat in the future humanely, all people who have fallen into our hands. At the same time, I would also like to remind you that foreign mercenaries are not subject to the 1949 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. And of course, I ask you to convey words of gratitude to all personnel for what has been done recently.
So he said, kill them. They're not prisoners of war. They're not soldiers. These terrorists are on our lands. Kill them.
I very much hope
Don't arrest them.
that all combat missions facing our units will be unconditionally fulfilled, and the territory of the Kursk region will soon be completely liberated from the enemy.
The fighting capacity of Ukrainian forces fighting in their area of operation in Kursk, Russia, have collapsed. Depending on what reports you're referring to, Ukrainian forces have either been pushed back to the border or they've been pushed entirely out of Kursk altogether. Let's take a look at the map. This is liveuamap.com. It's a pro-Ukrainian map. So a pro-Ukrainian map is showing the situation to be this bad. Imagine how much worse it probably is. So we look at all of Ukraine. In red is territory held by Russia, incorporated into the Russian Federation. This is Kherson, the Donbas region, Kharkov, and to the north is Sumy. Ukrainian forces crossed from Sumy into Kursk, and they took this area here. As you can see, they now cling to a very narrow strip of land along the border, and they have been entirely pushed out of the population center of Sudzha. This was the largest population center that they were able to seize and maintain control over. And now Russian forces, even according to this pro-Ukrainian map, have pushed them completely out of Sudzha. And this is a microcosm of what is taking place all along the line of contact. As I had pointed out, for the last 3 years, Russia is using a strategy of attrition. It is steadily, incrementally grinding down Ukrainian combat power faster than Ukraine and its Western sponsors can rebuild it. At the same time, Russia is increasing its own combat power faster than Ukraine and its Western sponsors can negate it. And eventually, we will arrive at a tipping point where there is a general collapse along the entire line of contact. A lot of analysts looking at the conflict in Ukraine are trying to figure out if it took Russia this long to get from where they started to where they are now over the last 3 years, then they try to extrapolate how long it would take them to take over all of Ukraine. But that is the wrong way to go about it. If this is a war of attrition and Ukrainian combat power is being steadily degraded, there will be a tipping point where there is a general collapse, and then Russia's ability to take territory will increase rapidly to the point where they may be able to, say, take everything up to the Dnieper River or even beyond. So the United States faces a very difficult choice, and I have warned that this choice would eventually be arrived at, and Washington would have to make a decision regarding it. They're going to come to a point where they will either have to accept that they have completely lost this proxy war with Russia in Ukraine and allow Russia to do what it wills inside of Ukraine, or it will attempt to freeze the conflict in a very similar way that it froze the conflict, its proxy war against Syria, which began in 2011. It went very poorly. The United States invaded eastern Syria. Turkey invaded northern Syria, and they froze the conflict. And then over the years that followed, they gradually undermined the Syrian economy and its military, and they began a process of overextending both Russia and Iran, Syria's primary allies. And then when the conditions were just right, they had the opportunity to finish the proxy war in their favor. And that is exactly what they did in December last year. They finally and fully overthrew the Syrian government and completely destroyed Syria as a functioning nation state. And so the plan is to do precisely this in Ukraine. They're not just going to give up Ukraine to Russia. There is a third option, which is for the US to get involved directly, or to get Europe involved directly and escalate. That is a possibility, but you have to remember from the very beginning, this was always meant to be a proxy war fought to the last Ukrainian. There's a whole policy paper where this is spelled out in detail. It is RAND Corporation's 2019 paper titled Extending Russia, Competing from Advantageous Ground. In the table of contents, you can see geopolitical measures. Number one is provide lethal aid to Ukraine. And this was actually begun under the first Trump administration. Increase support to the Syrian rebels. Promote regime change in Belarus. Exploit tensions in the South Caucasus. Reduce Russian influence in Central Asia. Challenge Russian presence in Moldova. They also talk about economic measures. Hinder petroleum exports. Reduce natural gas exports and hinder pipeline expansions, or just blow up the pipelines, impose sanctions, enhance Russian brain drain. All of these are measures meant to extend Russia. This isn't about Ukraine. This is about Russia. This is about a US policy that first and foremost seeks to overextend, encircle, contain, and eventually collapse Russia. And this is part of a much wider strategy meant to preserve American hegemony over the entire planet. It also includes a containment strategy aimed at China. So the US is unlikely to get involved directly in the conflict in Ukraine because it also needs to deal with China. And the United States has openly said this, including under the current Trump administration. They have explicitly said this. Back in February, I have repeatedly gone over U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth's directive that he gave Europe at that time, February 12th, 2025. He was
Revolutionary salute to our family and lunch break chronicles for the donation to the war chest. Revolution is a way of life. Absolutely appreciate the love, family salute. He say great content. I appreciate y'all showing up to continue to support the House of Revolution and Corfield King Wild. Revolution is a way of life. Salute, family. Appreciate the love.
In Europe, gave Europe a directive. He was not talking about ending the war. He was not talking about peace. He was telling Europe, you need to take over in Europe because we need to take on China. We cannot do both at the same time. We need to divide labor. He even literally said it's a division of labor. You need to double down on Ukraine while we deal with China. And I told people, I warned people that if you listen to this directive, it tells you everything about America's true intentions. They have no interest in peace. They never did. They told you this all along if only you listened to what they were really saying instead of projecting your own hopes and desires onto the incoming Trump administration. As a matter of fact, as far back as November 2024, before President Trump even stepped foot in office, I brought this article to everyone's attention. J.D. Vance tells Tim Dillon, U.S. needs weapons to fight China, not Russia. Everybody was convinced that President Trump wanted to pursue peace and focus inward on the United States. And I warned that not only is war and warmongering going to continue, it's going to escalate because the US still seeks primacy over the planet, not peace. And the window of opportunity is closing to achieve it. And the obstacles to achieving it are becoming greater and greater. And so the chance of escalation increases with it. And Vice President-elect at that time, J.D. Vance, was not talking about peace and focusing inward on the United States. He was talking about the war in Ukraine is lost. Europe can take over in Ukraine. We will pivot to China. That is what he said. That is what the Trump administration was saying back in November if people just listened. And then Secretary Hegseth laid it out in excruciating detail in February, on February 12th in Europe. So I'm going to play the video where he laid out his directive, and then I'm going to illustrate how, despite the theater that followed with this feigned divide between the US and Europe, Europe has now 100% fully and enthusiastically complied. Let's listen to Secretary Hegseth on February 12, 2025.
A durable peace for Ukraine must include robust security guarantees to ensure that the war will not begin again. This must not be Minsk 3.0. That said, the United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement. Instead, Any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops. If these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5. There also must be robust international oversight of the line of contact. To be clear, as part of any security guarantee, there will not be U.S. troops deployed to Ukraine. To further enable effective diplomacy and drive down energy prices that fund the Russian war machine, President Trump is unleashing American energy production and encouraging other nations to do the same. Lower energy prices, coupled with more effective enforcement of energy sanctions, will help bring Russia to the table. Safeguarding European security must be an imperative for European members of NATO. As part of this, Europe must provide the overwhelming share of future lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine. Members of this contact group must meet the moment. This means donating more ammunition and equipment, leveraging comparative advantages, expanding your defense industrial base, and importantly, leveling with your citizens about the threat facing Europe. Part of this is speaking frankly with your people about how this threat can only be met by spending more on defense.
Lies.
2% is not enough.
That means taking more money from
President Trump has called for 5%, and I agree. We're also here today to directly and unambiguously express that stark strategic realities prevent the United States of America from being primarily focused on the security of Europe. We also face a peer competitor in the communist Chinese with the capability and intent to threaten our homeland and core national interests in the Indo-Pacific. The U.S. is prioritizing deterring war with China in the Pacific, recognizing the reality of scarcity and making the resourcing trade-offs to ensure deterrence does not fail. As the United States prioritizes its attention to these threats, European allies must lead from the front. Together, we can establish a division of labor that maximizes our comparative advantages in Europe and Pacific, respectively. These are first steps. More must still be done. We ask each of your countries to step up on fulfilling the commitments that you have made. And we challenge your countries and your citizens to double down and recommit yourselves not only to Ukraine's immediate security needs, but to Europe's long-term defense and deterrence goals.
He talks about a security guarantee backed by capable European and non-European troops in Ukraine. Again, the creation of a buffer zone. And he says it needs to be a non-NATO mission, not covered under Article 5, because this is a proxy war. And if it's covered under Article 5, if Ukraine gets NATO membership, then the U.S. will have an obligation to intervene. It's a proxy war specifically because the U.S. does not want to intervene. They want to fight this war to the last Ukrainian. Then he talks about President Trump targeting Russian energy, precisely as laid out in the RAND Corporation, the 2019 RAND Corporation document extending Russia. And then he says, Europe must provide the overwhelming share of future lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine. So he's not talking about ending the conflict. He's not talking about ending the flow of arms to Ukraine. He's talking about expanding it. He talks about donating more ammunition and equipment. He talks about Europe expanding their defense industrial base. So you're freezing the conflict and you're pumping out more weapons and you're sending more weapons to Ukraine. This is Minsk 1, this is Minsk 2, and now he's unveiling Minsk 3. And at a certain point in the directive, he feels the necessity to try to convince you that this must not be Minsk 3.0, even though everything he's describing is Minsk 3.0. And as Russia sees it, NATO is at the root cause of this conflict. NATO's existence is to encircle and contain and eventually absorb Russia. And until that happens, it has been absorbing nations up to and all along Russia's border, transforming these nations into battering rams against Russia. And so what is the Trump administration doing to address this legitimate Russian security concern? Well, they're going to expand funding for NATO, make the problem even worse, more menacing for Russia. And so Secretary Hegseth tells Europe that expanding NATO funding up to 2% is not enough. It needs to be as high as 5%, so more than doubling it. And then he says, together we can establish a division of labor that maximizes our comparative advantages in Europe and Pacific, respectively, because he's talking about how the US cannot fight this proxy war against Russia and also take on China at the same time. Europe needs to take over the proxy war against Russia, and the United States will pivot to China. This is not about ending the conflict. This is about, and he literally says, a division of labor between Europe and the United States. So not a split between the US and Europe, a division of labor between the US and Europe. And at one point, he literally says that Europe needs to double down and recommit themselves to Ukraine and its immediate security needs. So that, if you listen to that, if you clear out all of your hopes and expectations, if you filter out the propaganda and the wishful thinking, he is laying out explicitly a Minsk 3.0 framework. He lays that out in February. We remember a week or two of theatrics where senior American officials are squabbling with senior European officials and leaders, calling each other names, disparaging one another, belittling one another. But at the end of the day, Europe fully complied with Secretary Hegseth's directive to the letter. And in some cases, they literally told Secretary Hegseth to his face that they were complying to his directive. So let's begin with Germany. This is from DW. Germany set to spend big on army and infrastructure. They're talking about hundreds of billions of euros to further arm the German military in the coming years. Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission President, EU chief, unveils 800 billion euro plan to rearm Europe. We're ready to step up. Step up to what? Step up to Secretary Hegseth's directive. And then she is citing US suspending military aid to Ukraine, which actually never happened. I'll get to that in just a moment. And then there is this. This is from the US Department of Defense's official website. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth greets the United Kingdom's Secretary of State for Defense, John Healey, and takes questions from the press. This was March 6, 2025, and Secretary Healey says this to Secretary Hegseth.
We last met last month in NATO, and then you challenged Europe to step up. You challenged us to step up on Ukraine, on defense spending, on European security. And I say to you that we have, we are, and we will further. And last week, the British Prime Minister announced the biggest increase in defense spending since the end of the Cold War, and we will go further.
You told us to take over the proxy war in Ukraine against Russia, and so we are. You told us to build out our defense industry. We are. You told us to spend more on arms and ammunition and to send more of it to Ukraine. We are. And so Secretary Hegseth, the United States, told Europe to do this, and Europe is complying. And what was this theater in between meant to do? It was meant to convince the European people that there was some serious sense of urgency, that the US was abandoning them, that there was this huge threat coming from Russia, and that Europe would have to make difficult decisions. They would have to redirect money from social programs to military spending to face this threat. And it's just as Secretary Hegseth said back in February.
Leveling with your citizens about the threat facing Europe. Part of this is speaking frankly with your people about how this threat can only be met by spending more on defense.
And so now you know. And the Russian government sees straight through this. In addition to Germany, the EU, the UK, there was also France. French President Emmanuel Macron, he proposed a supposed peace plan, dovetailing with all of this and with Secretary Hegseth's directive. And he was talking about sending European troops into Ukraine, just as Secretary Hegseth told them to. And to this, the Russian government officially responded to. And this is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation. And I'm conveying this to you so that you can see Russia's point of view, what they believe is behind this conflict, and how the Trump administration is doing absolutely nothing to address these concerns. This is what the Russian government says. President Macron's speech is all about providing security guarantees for Ukraine. Not a word, however, was said about security guarantees for Russia, notably the lack of such guarantees and the West's never-ending attempts to create threats to our country, primarily through unbridled expansion of NATO. It's the expansion of NATO that triggered this conflict in the first place, which ran counter to promises that were made to us about NATO's expansion. They said they would not expand NATO, but then they did anyway. As well as the push to turn Ukraine into an anti-Russian bridgehead has led to the current crisis. And I have pointed out how the US admits they were overthrowing the governments of Eastern European countries, former territories of the Soviet Union, in installing anti-Russian client regimes, and then transforming the military of these countries into hostile forces aimed at Russia. From 2003 to 2008, the U.S. went through this process in regards to Georgia, and in 2008, Georgian forces armed and backed by the U.S. attacked Russian peacekeepers, precipitating the conflict the summer of that year. The EU even investigated this conflict and found that Georgia provoked it. And then from 2014 onward, they overthrew the Ukrainian government and began the same process, but just on a much larger, more dangerous scale. This is what Russia is reacting to. This is what their statement is citing. Then it says the excessively forward assertions claiming that Russia had violated the Minsk agreements do not hold water and look like an attempt to shift the blame on us. Our country pushed for strict compliance with these agreements, while Kiev, with the tacit consent and incitement of its Western curators, sabotaged its commitments in every possible way. Former leaders of France, Germany, and Ukraine have repeatedly admitted in public that they merely took advantage of these agreements to get ready for war. And we know this is true because the Western media has admitted as much. This was from 2022. Angela Merkel opens up on Ukraine, Putin, and her legacy. And they talk about, Merkel said, the Minsk agreement, a 2014 deal she helped broker to ease the conflict between government forces and Russian-backed separatists, while not entirely palatable to the Ukrainians, bought important time for Ukraine. At the time, it brought calm and gave Ukraine, for example, a lot of time, 7 years to develop into what it is today. What is it today? In 2022, a large NATO-armed and trained battering ram aimed at Russia, that Russia eventually intervened and sought to dismantle. What has the Russian government said in this statement that isn't substantiated in the West's own media? The comments of Western leaders themselves, they admit that they were buying time. The Minsk agreements were about buying time. If you remember back around the time the Minsk agreements were made, the separatists in eastern Ukraine had surrounded Ukraine's forces. They were poorly trained, poorly armed, and they were crumbling. They were at the verge of defeat. And so the Minsk agreements were made. They talked with all the parties involved. They were talking with Russia, and they said, we want to resolve this. You win. We want peace. Let's work toward peace. But all it was a ploy to buy time, rearm Ukraine, and restart hostilities. So that is exactly what Secretary Hegseth, the United States under the Trump administration, are preparing. And this isn't the Trump administration's idea. This is something that myself and other analysts had been talking about for the last 3 years, all throughout the Biden administration. We were warning that this was going to happen no matter who won the election in 2020. This is where it was all inevitably headed. So let's talk about some of the details. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and others went to Saudi Arabia to talk with Ukrainian counterparts. about a deal. And what they eventually agreed upon was this 30-day ceasefire. So what this is all meant to do is freeze the conflict and buy time to rearm and reorganize Ukraine's military forces. It'll start with 30 days. And if Russia, for some reason, agrees to this, they will then look for ways to extend it. They will look for ways to exploit it, to create the conditions on the ground that make it very, very difficult for Russia to resume its military operation and basically to break Russia's current momentum, which you can see just steamrolled Ukrainian troops in Kursk. So this New York Times article, Ukraine must cede territory in any peace deal, Rubio says. So you're going to have to give up some territory, but that's just a reflection of reality. There's literally no way for the US and Europe, together with Ukraine, to get this territory back now. They can't. It's impossible. And so recognizing reality is not the same as wanting to actually solve this conflict. Secretary Rubio also says that Russia must make concessions itself. So Secretary Rubio is telling Ukraine, you have to make concessions. You need to give up territory. And Russia needs to make concessions. But if you think about it, this is a US proxy war. It was entirely engineered, provoked, and perpetuated by the United States. And at any time, the US can end this conflict. What the US is doing instead is posing as if this is a war between Ukraine and Russia, and the US is just mediating. That is how they're trying to lay all of this out as. What concessions is the US going to make? Secretary Rubio never says. President Trump never says. Secretary Hegseth never says. The conflict, again, is the direct result of NATO expansion up to and all along Russia's borders, its absorption, political capture of Eastern European countries, their transformation into hostile nations that have attacked Russia. And there is nothing in this proposal or anything at all from the Trump administration signaling any interest in addressing the actual root cause of this conflict, which is NATO. As a matter of fact, as Secretary Hegseth laid out in February, he wants Europe to more than double their funding for NATO to make it an even bigger threat to Russia. That is doubling down on the very root cause of this conflict. Now, there was that New York Times article. Then there was this article from Reuters. Trump threatens Russia with sanctions until Ukraine peace agreed. And this is all about accepting the ceasefire that Secretary Rubio and his Ukrainian counterparts would agree upon in Saudi Arabia, because that's what they emerged with from this meeting, a 30-day ceasefire proposal. And so this is what President Trump said. President Donald Trump raised the prospect of imposing large-scale U.S. sanctions on Russia days after pausing aid and intelligence sharing to Ukraine, which they never actually did. And again, I will get into that in just a moment, and called on both countries to get on with negotiating a peace deal. Again, this is not a war between Ukraine and Russia. It's a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia. It is the United States that needs to negotiate with Russia. Ukraine has no agency. They are doing what they are told. They are doing what they are enabled to do, nothing more, nothing less. And so this is all about shifting blame onto Ukraine and also absolving the US from, again, making any of the concessions they actually need to make if they actually wanted peace, which they obviously do not. They want Minsk 3. That is what this is about. Based on the fact that Russia is absolutely pounding Ukraine on the battlefield right now, I am strongly considering large-scale banking sanctions and tariffs on Russia until a ceasefire and final agreement, settlement agreement on peace is reached, Trump said. And then the meeting took place, and predictably, after the meeting and Ukraine agrees to immediate 30-day ceasefire, if Russia does so too, U.S. resumes military aid to Ukraine after Saudi ceasefire. But I have special U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff on Fox News admitting that intelligence was never paused between the U.S. and Ukraine. They just said it.
Well, we never. My best understanding, Bill, is that we never shut off intelligence for defensive for anything defensive that the Ukrainians need. So that's never been shut off.
Just like they're just saying they want peace with Russia. They're just saying it. They have no intention of actually doing it. And then following this meeting, this is what Secretary Marco Rubio says on X. Today was a good day for peace, thanks to the President of the United States leadership and under the gracious hospitality of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. We are a step closer to restoring durable peace for Ukraine. The ball is now in Russia's courts. And then despite all of this theater about this split, the end of the collective West, here is EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. We welcome today's news from Jeddah on the U.S.-Ukraine talks, including the proposal for a ceasefire agreement and the resumption of U.S. intelligence sharing and security assistance, which again never ended. Never ended. It was just being rerouted, and they didn't even actually pause intelligence sharing. This is positive development that can be a step towards a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace for Ukraine. The ball is now in Russia's court. There it is again. I'm sure that's just a coincidence. It's a very common phrase. Keir Starmer, Prime Minister of the UK, I warmly welcome the agreement today and congratulate President Trump and President Zelensky for this remarkable breakthrough. He doesn't say it here, but he does say it down here. As both American and Ukrainian delegations have said, and also Ursula von der Leyen, the ball is now in the Russian court. That's 3 times now. How about Emmanuel Macron, President of France? I welcome the progress made during the discussions between the United States of America and Ukraine held today in Jeddah, particularly regarding the idea of a possible 30-day ceasefire. The ball is now clearly in Russia's court. So somebody came out and said, this is the narrative. We are basically proposing Minsk 3, which is impossible for Russia to agree to because they are winning the war. If they continue fighting on the battlefield, they can resolve this fully in their favor without really any compromise at all. We are desperately trying to stop this conflict, and we need a ceasefire. So what we're going to do is paint Russia into a corner. We're going to make it look like we desperately want peace. And when we propose the 30-day ceasefire, which we know they cannot accept, they should not accept, when they reject it, we can say, look at Russia. We've done everything we can. We wanted peace. Russia obviously wants war. What else can we do? And then there is Kaja Kallas. What is she? She is the current Foreign Affairs and Security Policy Representative of the EU. What does she say? I welcome the U.S.-Ukraine talks in Jeddah, notably regarding a ceasefire and resumption of U.S. intelligence and security assistance to Ukraine. This is literally the exact same narrative, and they tried to reword it to make it sound like it's not verbatim. And then she says the ball, as always, is in Russia's court. I don't think she understands the concept of a ball in sports and how it's not always in one player or the other's court. It bounces back and forth. That is the whole point of this saying. But in her bid to try to make it look like she wasn't copying and pasting, that's what she decided to do. And so there you have it. The US and EU were working together, and the UK, obviously, NATO, we're all working in concert. This was theater to manage public perception, and it worked. I can't tell you how many people were calling me un-American, calling me disinterested in peace, calling me a traitor, saying I have Trump derangement syndrome, when I was warning people that this was all theater, that the US and Europe, they're all on the same page. This is all theater to force Russia into a corner, paint them into a corner, and then propose this ceasefire and force them to either to take it or to reject it and look incredibly bad, at least in part of the global public's eyes. That's what this is all about. Now, I want to talk about this cutting of aid. You just heard U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff admit that intelligence was never cut. And of course, it wasn't going to be cut. Even if they did cut it, technically, they're sharing the exact same intelligence with all of Europe. And all of Europe can just share it with Ukraine. I mean, that is how it works. I'll also show you some other examples of how when President Trump announced cutting all support for Ukraine off, this was a lie. It was a blatant lie. We have this from Business Insider. Elon Musk says he'll never turn off the Starlink terminals in Ukraine. Unconditional support for Ukraine from Elon Musk. But this is also something that Marco Rubio, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, said. No one has made any threats about cutting Ukraine off from Starlink. And then he's talking about how Starlink is essentially what is keeping Russia from being on the border with Poland right now. So Starlink, obviously a key aspect of U.S. military support for Ukraine, was never cut and will never be cut. Okay, so there you have it. And then some people will say, well, what about arms shipments? Well, the U.S. is not sending arms to Ukraine because they're out of arms. What little they have, they are sending. They can't send huge amounts of arms and ammunition to Ukraine because over the last 3 years, they've been running out of it. This began happening under the Biden administration. Nobody will suggest that President Biden was actually trying to cut Ukraine off. They simply had nothing left to send them. But anyway, right after President Trump announced that arms shipments to Ukraine would be cut, and a lot of people somehow, for some reason, imagined this was permanent, this came out. The UK government announced advanced attack drones for Ukraine in new deal struck by UK government and Anduril UK, which is just a subsidiary of what is an American company. Anduril is an American company based in America. They design and they make the drones there, and then they send them to the UK. That was back when there was all of this theater about a split between the US and Europe, and President Trump was either threatening or had already supposedly cut off arms shipments to Ukraine. And yet at the same time, US arms manufacturers were already planning on sending heaps of weapons to Europe to then be sent to Ukraine. So they didn't cut aid, they're rerouting it because, as Secretary Hegseth said, this is a division of labor. So what they can spare, they will send to Europe. Europe will send to Ukraine while they pivot and focus on China, exactly as planned. And then there was this claim, Washington Post, U.S. suspends commercial satellite imagery service to Ukraine, and this is via Maxar. So Maxar has contracts with the U.S. military, and the U.S. military gets these images and they relay them to Ukraine. But guess what? European militaries also have access to Maxar imagery, and they can just as easily send these images to Ukraine, unless there is a specific order from the U.S. government prohibiting them from doing so, which the U.S. government never even discussed on giving. This order was never even discussed. All of this adds up to Minsk 3.0. That is exactly what Secretary Hegseth laid out in February, and that is what the US and Europe have now openly created and have now proposed to Russia. They're talking about a 30-day ceasefire, and they've done it in such a way that they've kind of cornered Russia into accepting it. They're saying, we convinced Ukraine, as belligerent as it has acted, as belligerent as President Zelensky acted in the Oval Office, even he has now agreed to a 30-day ceasefire. Now the ball is in Russia's court. Now it's up to them to accept this and agree to a 30-day ceasefire under which the US can continue rearming Ukraine, Europe can continue rearming Ukraine, and it's 30 days they can try to use to find a way to get European troops into Ukraine. Find a way to create the conditions in which the ceasefire is extended, and also create the conditions that make it increasingly more difficult for Russia to restart hostilities once it becomes obvious that this is not a peace proposal. This is just to freeze the conflict, buy time to rearm, and restart hostilities when factors are more favorable to the US and Europe. And since we're talking about the Trump administration and unfulfilled promises, I want to bring this to your attention. I repeatedly warned that this dismantling of U.S. aid was not actually happening. They were not dismantling U.S. aid. They were streamlining it. They were making it a more efficient tool of interference abroad. And I explained to people that all of the programs that I personally have tracked for years, all of these organizations, all of these programs have continued uninterrupted throughout this entire process. We were hearing about all kinds of organizations losing their funding overnight and shutting down. But I'm sitting here in Asia where the US funds a huge army of opposition groups, and none of them, not even one of them, shut down. Not even one of them complained about their funding being cut. So clearly that was not what was happening. They were cutting off extra programs, waste, fraud, and abuse, but not to create an organization that actually helps people around the world, just an organization that is more effective at interfering around the world. And so this is exactly what Marco Rubio, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, announced. March 10th, 2025, after a 6-week review, we are officially canceling 83% of the programs at USAID. The 5,200 contracts that are now canceled spent tens of billions of dollars in ways that did not serve, and in some cases even harmed, the core national interests of the United States. What are those core national interests of the United States? Primacy is what those interests are. In consultation with Congress, we intend for the remaining 18% of programs we are keeping, approximately 1,000. So there's 1,000 programs that remain operational and continue to be funded. They will be administered more effectively under the State Department. More effectively. They streamlined it. This is exactly what I said was going to happen. That is what the Department of Government Efficiency was doing. They're not dismantling the tools of regime change. They are sharpening them. That is what he just told you. 1,000 programs. What do you think those programs entail? And because now they're under the State Department and you cannot find them on the USAID website anymore, it's more opaque. It's much harder for people like me who have been following this and researching this. It's more difficult to figure out what these programs are. But I can tell you that the programs that I already am aware of, they all remain operational, and their operations were not interrupted, not for a single day. That is what is happening under the Trump administration. Continuity of agenda. And now as the US and Europe have confirmed, by praising this 30-day ceasefire, essentially the framework of Minsk 3.0, and declaring verbatim with one voice, the ball is in Russia's court, unity of purpose. There was no split between the US and Europe. It was all theater. And I warned people that it was all theater, and now you can clearly see that it is all theater. I cannot blame people for being hopeful, for indulging in wishful thinking, in attempting to extend the benefit of the doubt. But once evidence begins adding up and reaches a certain threshold, you just have to admit that this is not the change that people were hoping for, to accept that it isn't, and then to begin looking at it more realistically, exposing what is really happening rather than trying to justify and defend it. And of course, speaking out against it, which is what I will continue to do. This is what I did for the last 4 years under the Biden administration. And as long as there is continuity of agenda regarding US foreign policy, I will continue criticizing it. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share.
March 13, 2025, and our friend Pepe Escobar is back with us. Welcome back, Pepe.
Sawadee Kap, Nima, all of you. Greetings from Thailand, one of the Chinese towers right behind me. Greetings from ASEAN, and greetings from a BRICS partner.
Let's get started, Pepe, with what has happened between Ukraine and the United States. They're talking about a 30-day ceasefire. And right after that, you see that Marco Rubio put out on his social media on X that the ball is now on Russia's court and reiterated by Emmanuel Macron, Kaya Kallas, and Ursula von der Leyen. And if I were in Moscow, I would say, what are they doing? And is that a coordinated sort of policy attitude on the part of the West? On the other hand, the Russians are talking about they don't know the details. And the question right now, the main doubt on the part of Russians, I think, is the details of what has happened in Saudi Arabia. What's your take on what has happened?
Well, many of the answers to your very good question are already the way you posed it. When you came with the litany of spiders that immediately approved the 30-day ceasefire, that's part of the answer. This is what they wanted, because they know that this is absolutely ideal for, in the current mega negative conditions for Ukraine, in the Donbass battlefields and in Kursk, which they practically abandoned. It would be perfect. 30-day to regroup, rearm, and continue the war when they are losing badly on every front. So it's no wonder that these specimens in Europe approved it. Well, as we know, as we're speaking right now, Witkoff is already in Moscow. He landed a few hours ago. So he might meet Putin maybe, let's say, early evening on this Thursday or on Friday morning. So before the weekend, we're going to have the official Russian, I wouldn't say response, but the Russian reasoning to, I described this, in a very, very short manner on my ex Twitter account as a tawdry kabuki spectacle inside a matryoshka, which is what it is. This is a matryoshka, it's cheap matryoshka, not the really good ones. And inside you have a lot of kabuki figures. And you're peeling off the masks of these kabuki figures. At the end, what you see? You see one of the matryoshka figures dressed up as Minsk 3. This is let's say, a sort of a Minsk 3 in drag. Maybe this matryoshka is an LGBT woke. And that would explain why the Europeans loved it so much. But let's call her Lady Minsk 3. And if we can all see that, Nima, obviously the best minds in Moscow can also see it for what it is. So what is required from Russia now, considering that this is a major change of narrative? And once again, the only thing that the empire and the attaches of the empire know what to do is to, they are in the narrative confectionery business. So they can change from narrative to some narrative. Some with more sugar, some with less sugar, some like a tiramisu, you name it. So the Russians are going to have to apply another Sun Tzu maneuver. And basically, they will say, of course, we are in favor of a ceasefire. But what kind of ceasefire? What are as you said in your part of your question, what are the details of the ceasefire? Apparently, considering what was leaked, Witkoff is going to tell Putin I would say the footnotes of this big bombastic pronouncement. Ukraine agreed to a 30-day ceasefire, and now the ball is in Russia's court. Well, the Russians don't even know what kind of a ball is that, right? So when Witkoff theoretically explains what's inside the ball to Putin, then we're going to have a Russian counterpunch, let's put it this way. We all know that the ceasefire per se is beyond absurd. And even people who still have their critical faculties in the West, they know it as well, although they cannot say it in public. So we had already a partial response, which was fascinating yesterday. For the first time since the beginning of the SMO, Putin was wearing a military uniform. Exactly. This is what you're showing it now. When he visited and Gerasimov, of course, went out to greet him personally. Then he read his report, etc. This is the first time that we see the commander-in-chief of armed forces of the Russian Federation in a military uniform. And this is extremely serious because, among other things, he wants the operation in Kursk to finish as soon as possible, and that's exactly what's happening. He went there to basically order, finish this up now. He designated the Ukrainians in Kursk as terrorists, and all the foreigners who are there are mercenaries that are not covered by the Geneva Convention, so we can all imagine what's going to happen to these mercenaries. So this is a pretty serious deal, right? So we can interpret this as, let's sort a preliminary response. Now it's different. Now we're going to have, for instance, in a serious diplomatic world, we would have the US Secretary of State going to Russia to talk to the president of the Russian Federation. We have an emissary. That's not very serious, but okay, this is the Trump world, right? This guy's not even a diplomat, Nima. This guy's a real estate billionaire mogul from New York. So he's not exactly a diplomat. So, okay, so the President Putin and the Security Council in Moscow, okay, all right. Consider that this guy is speaking directly as if it's coming from the President of the United States. Let's hear what he has to say. There will be no big news about it because the Russians already know the backstory leading to what happened in Jeddah. And the way the Brits basically pulled Zelensky by the neck, sat him down and said, now you're going to listen to us and you're going to do exactly what we're going to tell you because you have to mend the situation that you fucked up in the first place. So Zelensky, since Jeddah, and he was not in Jeddah. This was the previous to the US-Ukraine delegations meeting in Jeddah. He changed completely his own narrative. He apologized, even if not properly. But once again, this is Kiev, a bunch of criminals. And basically, he's following the British diktat, let's put it this way. And that's where our kabuki masks inside the matryoshka, they acquire a swamp element to it. You know, they are slimy, they are horrible, they're like toxic underwater animals, you know, because it goes directly to the Brit interest in prolonging this war as long as possible. And the deal that they already signed before with Zelensky, a completely illegal deal signed with a completely illegal president, the famous 100-year partnership as it was sold by that ghastly creature Starmer, where one of the hidden clauses that nobody knows about because nobody actually read it, but once again, because he's a loudmouth, Boris Johnson himself let it escape what's in the footnotes, in the hidden footnotes, is that basically these minerals and what was going to be left of rare earth deposits in what's going to be left of Ukraine, plus the ports and all that will be managed by the Brits, not by the Americans. So this is the Brit-Zelensky totally illegal deal that was already signed, clinched by both parties. The Americans know that, and the Americans want their own deal with Zelensky, which, if they sign with Zelensky, is also going to be illegal because he is an illegal president at the moment. So then we have an intra-NATO fight between the Brits and the Americans. And now they are positioning to see which party is going to get the best possible deal out of this expiring presidency sooner or later. The Brits are already grooming their man, the next leader of Ukraine, Zelensky, in London for months now. And the Americans want somebody else, which they still don't have their candidate. So, so the clash continues. What Jeddah allowed was something even more perverse, Nima, was once again the realignment of Americans and Europeans, Westerners, Brits included, on rearming Ukraine. So this is the key thing. All this blah, blah, blah about ceasefire deal pales compared to the fact that the Americans are continuing now, they are restarting, providing Ukraine with intel, which they had suspended for a while, and obviously with more weapons later on. So as you can see, and our audience can see, this is really a very toxic matryoshka environment, And obviously the Russians can see all the details, especially because they follow all the devious games of perfidious Albion in detail, considering that the UK is formally at every level at war with Russia. They are directly at war with Russia, and the British ruling classes are directly at war with Russia. And Moscow, they understand this perfectly well. But because they are too polite and still too diplomatic, they haven't done anything drastic about it yet. But we may be getting there later on, right? So what we can expect about let's say, the Russian qualification of the 30-day ceasefire is, well, we received information from your emissary, Mr. President, talking to Trump. And once again, our position has been very clear for months, from now on, reiterated over and over again by President Putin, by the Minister of Foreign Relations, everything. Without following these guidelines, there will be no ceasefire. If we follow these guidelines, of course, we're more than ready for a ceasefire. So what we're going to have? We're going to have probably a tantrum in Washington. We're going to have a serial tantrum by Trump, Rubio, emissaries, generals, whatever, and the war will continue, which suits Russia fine, because Russia is advancing and Russia is winning the war on an everyday basis. So that's where we are at the moment. We are at a wait-and-see moment, basically for the continuation of what was happening until a few days ago. But now, obviously, with always an extra element of bombast, fireworks, firecrackers, which the essence of Mr. Disco Inferno and Trump 2.0. The problem is, Nima and all of you, is that all these things condition the news cycle, all these changes of narrative. And in 1, 2, 3 days, there'll be another radical change of narrative. And they never address the root cause of the war in Ukraine. And this is what the Russians are trying to, maybe they'll try to imprint once again in a phone call. Maybe the next few days, we're going to have a new phone call, Putin, Trump, and Putin will have to explain on the phone, perhaps for 2 hours at least, the root causes of the war and why Russia is insisting that we cannot have a ceasefire and the beginning of a solution in Ukraine if we don't address the root causes of everything that has been happening, not only since Maidan, but even before, since the fall of the Soviet Union, for that matter. But is Trump ready to understand that? No. Are the people around him ready to understand that? No. Is the deep state ready to understand that? No, no, no. And are the American ruling classes ready to admit that this is what has to be discussed, zillions of no's. There you go.
I'm not even sure that Donald Trump knows the reality of what's going on in
He
between
does
Russia
not.
and Ukraine.
He does not. He has no clue. And he doesn't have anybody
Well,
to
he shouldn't play
actually
tough with Putin. That's a mistake.
sit down with him and provide this information. Of course, he does. He could talk to Colonel Douglas McGregor. He could talk to Mayor Scheimer face to face. You know, of course, there are excellent American analysts who know exactly what's going on since Maidan and even before Maidan. Even better, Jeffrey Sachs can tell him the whole story coming from the 90s, you know. But people around Trump, obviously not. It's not going to be those two-bit real estate tycoons in New York who are going to explain the intricacies of the post-Cold War environment in Ukraine and the post-Soviet space. They have absolutely no clue about that.
We have to accept that Donald Trump is so much influenced by what he sees and what he's been told to. And we know that we had a Ukrainian drone attack on Russia before this talks happening.
Yes.
It seems that, in my opinion, is a British move. They're trying to provide intelligence to Ukrainians to do that in order to convince Trump that Zelensky is able, Ukraine is able to fight Russia. Let's fight.
We needed to show something before Jeddah, Nima. You're absolutely correct. So what better PR operation than launching 350 drones, and many of them directed against Moscow itself? So now we are still fighting. But this is basic MI. This is basic. You studied this on MI6 for beginners. You know, this is what they do all the time. And obviously, the Brits are controlling everything that is coming out of Kiev, especially now that after they signed the so-called 100-year deal partnership or whatever. So they are much more dangerous than NATO, much more dangerous than Europeans individually. Compared to the pitiful French and Germans, you know, the Brits are way ahead, especially because they already have the long-term thing planned. And for instance, this is a control of ports, for instance. This means in practice, the Brits controlling the port of Odessa. This is absolutely key in the whole story. They will do anything possible apart from maybe nuclear war to prevent the Russians to get all the way to Odessa, because they need control of at least a substantial part of the Black Sea. And they need control of what's left of Ukraine. Ukraine needs Black Sea outlets. So they'll do everything about it. This is the key factor in the whole thing. The Black Sea. It's the key factor. The Americans, maybe they don't see it very much because Trump doesn't even care about NATO. Trump is looking at, obviously, China. And he would love, at best, a new NATO with Poland as the center of this new controlling NATO, going towards Eastern Europe. And they have the perfect bunch of rabbit poles to conduct the new NATO business from now on. Now, this is as far as Trump goes in terms of NATO. And for the rest, we all know, pay up 5%, and if you don't, that's it. We won't do anything to defend you.
I think the main concern on the part of Russians is what the British government is trying to do. As you mentioned, they're talking about, they're preparing Zelensky to be the next president of Ukraine. But I would also consider Zelensky to be re-elected again, because they are preparing for everything, and we know what has happened in Romania. We know what they're doing in Romania. Ukraine is a mess, is a chaos.
Absolutely.
And they can do the same in Ukraine. They can put whatever they want, whoever they want as the president of Ukraine, and make Ukraine, I think it's not all about the preconditions for the ceasefire. It's about what comes next in the aftermath of a Ukrainian settlement. What would happen to the western part of Ukraine? Are they going to make a new Idlib for Russia at their border? I think this is the huge concern on the part of Russia, and they have to think of this.
Exactly. It's a huge concern. And at the same time, there is the other possibility, which is, what if Western Ukraine is going to be a free-for-all? The Russians won't say no. Okay, Hungarians, Polish, Romanians, come here and take all the lands that were yours until the beginning of the 20th century. Cool. Perfect. So, the possibility is still open of total Balkanization of Ukraine and fragmentation of Ukraine, of post Ukraine, rump Ukraine, whatever you want to call it. Of course, but the Russians know exactly what they want. Apart from Novorossiya, apart from the regions which are now part of Russia, legally, constitutionally, what's open is all the way to Odessa and the famous link with Transnistria. We don't know. Once again, very important. The only one who knows as far Russia wants to go and is willing to go is the big guy. And he's not going to tell anybody, not even Gerasimov.
I don't know if you saw in the Financial Times, there is an article that it says that the Polish president is asking the United States to put nuclear bombs on
nuclear weapons in Poland.
It's yeah.
How can you possibly take these imbeciles as seriously? If you say something like this, not only proves that you are no diplomat, but you are suicidal. It's beyond any Russian red line, And the Russians always will make sure that, okay, just wait, do it, just wait. But what can you expect? They are like a very happy bunch of cockroaches after the Singing Jeddah. All of them, the Poles, the Brits, the batshit Estonian chick, von der Lugen, all of them, a choir of cockroaches, dancing in the middle of the, wow. It's like Chic was playing in the background. Les fric, c'est chic. It's pathetic. It's absolutely pathetic. But it was a tactical victory for them. And we can interpret this to a large extent that the so-called divide between Washington and Brussels is not that much a divide in the end. This is also part of a narrative that is being planted a little bit everywhere. What we know for sure is that in terms of the US deep state and Brussels, they still want exactly what they wanted before Trump came to power. The problem now for them is Trump trying to get some sort of dialogue with Putin. And that's why both are immediately lumped together as a sort of new Hitlerian amorphous concoction. That's the problem. So never underestimate the deep state and never underestimate how immensely corrupt the whole Brussels system is. And they still want exactly what they wanted. Even if they have an IQ over 10, they can see that Project Ukraine is dead. No, it's the return of the living dead. They want the return of the living dead ad infinitum. Because this is their way. One day we're going to make it in terms of inflicting strategic defeat against Russia. Maybe not now, but maybe if we rearm Ukraine, maybe in 1 year, maybe there's going to be an Ukrainian offensive in 2026. They actually believe in all this crap. So this has not changed at all. And Trump, it's getting more and more complicated by the day, because there are many. If we start to connect some of the dots, he's getting lost in his own bombast, because he needs one bombast a day to monopolize the news cycle day after day. Now he's entangled in everything that he's saying and promising, and now we are 75% getting close to a solution in Ukraine and all that. No, you don't have facts to back that up. You have just bombast. So you cannot have a foreign policy based on bombast after bombast, which is what we have so far, right? And obviously, when you have a team around them.
Revolutionary salute to our Queen RT Bell for the donation to the war chest. Revolution is a way of life. Absolutely appreciate the little queen. She said, thank you, good brother, for keeping the community informed. I appreciate the community for showing up for this information. Revolution is a way of life. Absolutely appreciate you, queen. Salute to you.
They are not. Can you, Nima, give me a break. Put Marco Rubio and Sergei Lavrov in the same room. It's even unfair. The gap is unfair. You know, get a 2-bit tycoon like Witkov getting to the Kremlin to talk to Putin and the big guys around. Come on, it's a joke. It's a joke. So obviously the Russians know that. It's not that they don't take it serious. They take it with the typical Russian smirk over here. And they're very says, wow, we have to deal with these clowns all over again. Can they come up with something tangible and realistic? For the moment, nothing. Absolutely nothing.
What comes to your mind when Europeans want some sort of security guarantee for Ukraine? What do they want to give to Ukraine? What do they want to provide Ukraine with?
Nothing. The only thing that they can provide Ukraine, by the way, with money that they don't have, is more weapons. In fact, the metaphor came from the toxic Medusa in Brussels herself. Nah? Was it a steel porcupine, if I'm not mistaken? Her own words. I think this summarizes what the EU and the European Commission want from Ukraine. A perpetual steel porcupine provoking the bear. Ad infinitum. That's it. They don't care about Ukrainians. They don't care about Ukrainian NATO, because obviously nobody in his right mind in Europe, different nation states, will allow Ukraine to be part of the EU. They don't care about Ukraine or NATO, but they want a hyper-armed, weaponized to death steel porcupine provoking Russia. This is what remains of Project Ukraine, right? So they will consider this a victory, right? And that's where all this blah, blah, blah of the new BlackRock Chancellor of Germany, the absolutely ghastly Petit Roi in Paris, new armies, peacekeeping forces, rearming Europe, and obviously the Brussels fabulous plan of getting 800 billion euros out of thin air to rearm Europe. And now I'm talking to a lot of my European contacts, sources, etc. The average European citizen, especially in Germany, in France, they are already starting to feel extremely paranoid about their money. They are already starting to make moves to get their money out of Europe. Because sooner or later, what are we going to have, Nima? We're going to have nation states in Europe, part of the European Union, going after Europeans' savings accounts to finance this 800 billion rearm plan. This, in some countries, If this happens in France and it's legitimized by the French parliament, then I assure you, and I assure all of you, there will be a civil war in France. There's no question about that. You can do anything with the French except try to confiscate their money, especially their savings, right? One glimpse of rationality. The Dutch parliament, 2 days ago or so, they vetoed Dutch taxpayers' contribution to this bloody 800 billion euro rearm fantasy. So it will depend on national parliaments in all these nations to veto this idea and cut off Brussels' neck with that. But they can, don't forget, Brussels, they can always find a way around it. So this is extremely serious in terms of the everyday life of the average European citizen. They are all like, oh shit, they're going to come after our money. And they will. And they will.
If you remember, there was an article 2-3 days ago. We had an article in Financial Times. It says that France, Germany, and the United Kingdom are doing everything in order to make any sort of Ukrainian settlement between the United States and Russia inoperable.
Inoperable. You're absolutely correct. Of course they are.
Here is what Nikolai Patrushev, he said that there is information that NATO countries intend to intensify terrorist actions against Russia on the Russian underwater pipelines, tankers, and dry cargo ships. If they go after some sort of terrorist attacks to sabotage what has happened so far or what is going to happen between Russia and
Revolutionary salute to our Queen Shannon G for the donation to the war chest. Revolution is a way of life. Absolutely appreciate the little Queen salute. She say coffee good news, support the platform. The platform definitely appreciate you supporting us, helping us keep the lights on. Revolution is a way of life. Salute, Queen.
and the United States. What do we know about the reaction coming out of Washington and Moscow?
Nima, we don't know. The only thing we know is that Putin will finally have to take the gloves off. In fact, he kept the gloves on for 3 years already. That's very, very long. And there are a lot of people in Russia public opinion, discussions that we have with well-placed people in Moscow. And there is a feeling that, look, that's enough. Solve this thing, meaning militarily solve this thing, which is something that the Russians could have done it before. They don't because they want to minimize civilian casualties in Ukraine. So they are fighting with one hand behind their backs all the time. So if we have the West, or what's left of the collective West, as we know now, is dead and buried. But let's say the hyena phase of the former collective West, which is basically the European Union, European Commission, and NATO. If they start using mercenaries for terror attacks against Russia, then all gloves will have to be off. And obviously the Americans, they can always have plausible deniability. The Trump administration can always say, look, we have nothing to do with this. This is the Europeans that are doing. So the wrath of the bear will be directed against Europe, not the US, which is something that Trump may use to disconnect the US from NATO in several levels. And everything that happens that is negative, he goes on, after all, he controls the globe's megaphone, right? And he says, look, we have nothing to do with this. They did it. So it's very, very serious, because the possibilities of, I would say, a fragmentation of the war by the post-collective West against Russia, they are planting the seeds now. It's like a fragmentation bomb, and then we're going to have, splinters going all over the spectrum, and obviously hurting Russia. So Narishkin knows that, the FSB know that, Patrushev know that, the top guys in Moscow, they all know that. And obviously they are doing their preparations. No question about that. But the last word obviously comes from the big guy. And the big guy, after this very, very cowardly attack with the drones right before Jeddah, and donning his military uniform, that was a pretty powerful message. Very, very powerful. Symbolically, wow, up there, like, look, there are limits, and you are exhausting my patience. And it's a very bad move to exhaust the patience of the top bear. But that's where we're heading. And with the Americans, they're being very, very patient. And Lavrov has been saying it over and over again. When he talked to our friends earlier this week, Judge Knapp and Larry in Moscow, was a wonderful, Larry told me it was a wonderful comment, and it was. You can feel that Lavrov loves talking to foreigners that try to understand the Russian position. There are not many.
Revolutionary salute to our Queen Shanagy for another donation to the war chest. Revolution is a way of life. Absolutely appreciate the love, Queen. Salute to you.
Very, very few. And when we are in Moscow, any of us, and we have a chance to talk to him, you can feel how he relishes talking to rational analysts from abroad, which is something that he never had. Very, very few opportunities to do that in Russia. And with the Europeans, forget it. Absolutely out of the question. But they're being very, very patient, Nima, very, very patient. But if Trump keeps pulling these stunts, one stunt after another, without substance, based only on bombast and controlling the news cycle, sooner or later, the Russian patience is going to disappear as well. Vis-a-vis the Trump administration. So, they still have, I would say, a little bit of political capital in the, let's say, the first 100 years, right? But if they do something again like they did with the Jeddah thing, which was basically to have Trump be able to tell the whole world, I'm posing as a peacemaker, and I managed to convince those idiots in Kiev to accept a ceasefire. And now I hope the Russians are going to do the same. Without context, without putting it into perspective, nothing. It's a cheap stunt. It's a circus ringmaster kind of gambit, The Russians are very serious people. The people at the leadership, they want a serious, the beginning of a serious discussion. We are at the stage of having diplomatic missions on both sides, getting into a kind of renewed dialogue, serious dialogue, etc., and then start discussing the serious issues. If you keep pulling up this stunts, what kind of seriousness there is, Sooner or later, the Russians are going to say, no, we also cannot trust these people. It's a bunch of clowns.
Yeah.
But that's Trump's modus operandi, Nima. It's like that. The problem is, it's all, well, in Texas, I love this Texas saying, all hat and no cattle. In the case of Trump, it's the same thing. All bombastic hat and zero cattle. The cattle is dead.
Pepe, here is what Lavrov said in that meeting that you mentioned between Lavrov and
with
Larry
the judge,
Johnson, and had the judge there. Yeah. Here is what he said in terms of the interest of Russian Federation, Russia and the United States.
Okay.
I want normal relations. Normal relations in the sense that the foundation of the American foreign policy under the Trump administration is national interest of the United States. This is absolute and without any discussion. But at the same time, we understand that other countries also have their national interests. Right. And those countries who have their national interests and don't play into the hands of somebody else's interest, right, we are ready to have serious discussion. It is very well understood, they told us, that countries like the United States and Russia would never have their national interest the same. They would not coincide, maybe even 50 or less percent. But when they do coincide, this situation, if we are responsible politicians, must be used to develop this simultaneous and similar interest into something practical which would be mutually beneficial, be it economic projects, infrastructural projects, something else. And then another message went, but when the interests do not coincide and contradict each other, again, this is then the responsible countries must do everything not to allow this contradiction to degenerate into confrontation, especially military confrontation, which would be disastrous for many other countries.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a portrait of rationality, isn't Nima?
Yeah.
And explained very diplomatically, taking care of all sides, you know, inclusiveness. This is what a real diplomat does. Do we see American diplomats do something like this? Or not to mention the chihuahuas in Europe? No, out of the question. We could see the Chinese do it, like Wang Yi. Last week, I was concentrated on the two sessions in Beijing, especially when Wang Yi spoke to the media on Friday. And Wang Yi sounded like Lavrov. No wonder they get along so well. Taking the interests of everybody, you know, sitting at the same table, and even if there are contradictions, do our best so this won't degenerate into a military confrontation, like Lavrov just said. You know, if this was an European diplomat speaking, like the batshit crazy Estonian chick in head of European foreign policy, she starts with war by definition. She can only think in terms of, her brain is wired to think in terms of confrontation and war. It's not a diplomatic brain. When we see Lavrov, we see immediately how a diplomatic brain works.
And what's so strange, I think, to Europeans is the national interest. That when he's talking about the national interest, what does that mean for European? I don't know if that exists in Europe anymore.
It doesn't. You're right. It doesn't exist because national interest in terms of the European Union and Brussels is the interest of the Brussels machine. It's not the national interest of Lisbon or Rome. No, not at all. So the fact that when in terms of diplomacy, when you talk about Europe, you're talking about a construct, about something completely artificial that doesn't care and doesn't take into consideration national interests of the nation states. By definition, that explains why there's no diplomacy in Europe. Because the nation states are not duly represented. You are defending the interests of a Kafkian machine, essentially.
The other point that he's making in this talk, that Russia and the United States can cooperate, can normalize their relationship, but we know that we have our differences. We have our way of getting better and improving. That's why here comes the idea of greater Eurasia, which was mentioned by the Russian officials. They're talking about, which the United States is not part of that. The United States doesn't want to cooperate with that, at least under the Biden administration. We don't know yet if the Trump administration is going to have a new attitude. How do you see the deal, this sort of communication between the Trump administration and Russia, the way that Lavrov is trying to picture that. He says less than 50%, less than 50%. It's huge when he's talking. He's brutally honest with Americans. How do you see the communication between the two parties?
They're starting, Nima. They are in the, once again, they are in the first stage of establishing credible and relatively deep diplomatic communication between both diplomatic missions in Washington and in Moscow, especially. So we are practically, this is a restart from zero. They are rebooting the operating system from scratch because it was completely destroyed during the previous crash test dummy experiment, let's put it this way. So at least now we have, let's say, a glimmer of hope in terms of rational dialogue between Washington and Moscow. In terms of Moscow and Brussels, forget it. Absolutely out of the question. You have to destroy the European Commission and restart them, which is something that is not going to happen in the near future, unfortunately, right? So, and that fits into our analysis of the end of the collective West. If this restart of a dialogue between Washington and Moscow in the next few weeks and months start to have, you know, fruits that everybody can see, look around and say, wow, it's working, etc. Obviously, Brussels, they're going to get even more isolated. Of course, they're going to get angrier. Their terror tactics were going to be exploding everywhere. But who cares? Because they are irrelevant. Geopolitically and geoeconomically, morally, ethically, nowadays, they are plunging into total irrelevance. I always remember what Gore Vidal was saying in the mid-1980s. To give you an idea, all of you, that was a long time ago, exactly. It was when I started as a foreign correspondent. I went to the signing of one of his books in London. And then we had a brief conversation afterwards. And Gore Vidal was saying at the time was, in the future, Europe is not going to be more than a boutique. This was 40 years ago. He could see the long term. That's absolutely what it is now. Europe, for a great deal of the global south, the global majority, will be, okay, let's go there and buy a few Gucci's, Hermes, Louis Vuitton, eat very good food, and then we leave. That's it. You know, irrelevant, a tourist destination. And for many, not a tourist destination because it's horribly expensive, right? For those who can afford it. But in the international arena, in terms of setting the tone of diplomatic relations and geopolitical relations across the globe, completely irrelevant. And because of them, they are digging their own graves. Their leadership in Brussels is digging their own graves, and the guidelines that they impose on the nation states. That's it. It's a very sorry affair. I wonder what the great diplomats of the European past, let's put it this way, if they were alive today, and we will be seeing that as like, you know, Bismarck, Talleyrand, Metternich, you know, they will be like, wow, what have we done wrong? Oh, okay. You're going to have to study how the European Union was conceived. That will answer a lot of questions.
Was that surprising to you that China, for the first time, is saying that the United States is trying to bully Russia? They're saying that the way that, in terms of right after the ceasefire, they said that it's not a good sign that the United States is going to deal with Russia. They didn't find it, and they were just honestly reporting on it. They're saying that it doesn't work if you go that way. Is there, because in the talk that Lavrov had with Larry and George, he said that he was somehow citing China, India, and the global south that don't be concerned about what's going on right now between Russia and the United States. And even he mentioned Africa, and we have our ties. There is nothing to in between us and between us as the party, as a party. How do you see, is there any sort of concern on the part of global south that the Trump administration may make some sort of move that they can, I don't know, separate Russia from the global south? Is there any sort of concern on considering that? That's why China is talking this way?
The best Chinese analysts, Nima, they are paying very, very close attention to this dance, the Trump-Putin dance. In fact, only Trump is dancing. He's dancing with himself. That reminds me of the old Billy Idol hit, Dancing with Myself. That's Trump once again. And Trump was probably dancing that in New York at discotheques during the 80s. So he's dancing with himself, and the Russians are looking. The Russians are spectators at the moment. The Chinese are also spectators, and they are scrutinizing every move. It's fascinating. If you go to Guangzhou, for instance, which I go every day to Guangzhou, some of the analysis are outstanding by some of the best Chinese academics. For instance, they know they do the breakdown of the forces supporting Trump, and they do the breakdown of their internal contradictions as well. For instance, when they do the breakdown and they say, okay, there are three powers behind Trump, three major powers. And that's very Chinese. It's always a numerological thing. The three major powers are Wall Street, heavy industry, especially steel, mining, and energy, and Silicon Valley. But they have competing agendas, and then they enumerate the agendas. And then there are the side powers. They are not very important, but they also have a say, like real estate, for instance. So it's fascinating. So they know exactly what's going on in Washington and in New York, the Chinese. And obviously, when they get deeper into, okay, what about us? They say, look, this anything that they try to divide Russia from China is bound to fail. And then, of course, they it's like they are reiterating what Wang Yi said last Friday at the end of the two sessions about the Russia-China strategic partnership and what the Russians are also saying about it. And of course, in terms of BRICS, they don't specifically get into what BRICS should do this year, for instance. But they use a sort of indirect Chinese comparison using the Belt and Road Initiative, using the New Silk Roads. For the Chinese, BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, and BRICS, they are interconnected, and they are in many aspects. For them, the priority in terms of Chinese geopolitics and geoeconomics is BRI. It's not BRICS, although they are one of the top BRICS. At the same time, they understand that they are one of the top BRICS and their top partners, Russia, China, Iran as well. Brazil is more complicated. Brazil is a bit too far away from everything. But because Brazil, the largest trade partner of Brazil is China, the Chinese pay a lot of attention to Brazil. So they, in their minds, they say, whatever he does, he's not going to affect how we as BRICS are integrating more and more. So it's fascinating. They don't seem to be, they are not intimidated by any move by Trump 2.0. They are not afraid of what may come next. Wang Yi actually said bluntly, and Wang Yi is usually extremely diplomatic. He said, look, we are prepared for any kind of war. If they want a war, whatever war, hybrid war, we're ready. And they are. They are. The Chinese are ready. And when you look at how they were planning economically for the year 2025, this mix of what they call the dual role economically, like lots of internal investments, domestic investors, and at the same time amplifying their global reach as a huge trading power. They will continue to do exactly the same thing. And they admit their challenges, the real estate market, creation of jobs. They want to create 12 million extra jobs, investment in all the top high-tech domains, which will continue. It's the Made in China 2025. I recommend all of you, our audiences, take a look at my column for Sputnik this week. The title is Made in China 2025 Revisited, where I talk about all these vectors, domestic Chinese policy, Chinese foreign policy, and why they are succeeding over and over again, and why they are not intimidated by anything that Trump may come up with. You want another tsunami of tariffs? No problem. We're going to have our counter tariffs. Do you matter for us, America, as a trade partner? No, you don't. Because our trade is with the whole planet, and you are, 3, 4, 5% of our global trade. Our trade is with the global South, with the global majority, essentially, and much more with Europe than with the US. So tariffs on us, we don't care. Bring it on. So this Chinese steadfastness and clear vision of what they're doing and where they're going, it's very refreshing to follow that and compare it, of course, with this total circus coming out of the US, right? And obviously, in terms of Europe, it's like worms having a conversation in the graveyard,
I don't know if Donald Trump is prepared for that. You see,
No, he's not.
confusion in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and
No.
he's not. We were talking about the bigger picture. We were talking about what's going on between the East and the West, between the United States particularly and China. But you see the game that he's playing with Russia in Ukraine. It's unbelievable.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because, first of all, he's not a strategist. He's not a diplomat. He doesn't have patience. He's obsessed with striking deals that are good for him. Usually not win-win deals, Chinese style, but win-lose deals. And not to mention the megalomania, which is intergalactic, right? Everything revolves around him. He's literally the Sun King all the time. So obviously, a character like that is not prepared to have a role of peacemaker and deal maker around the world, which implies respecting the other, implies mutual respect in every level, implies what Lavrov was telling our friends, sitting on the same table, listen to all the sides, and try not to get into confrontation. If there is danger of getting into some sort of heavy confrontation, try to minimize the possibilities. This is what diplomacy is all about.
Yeah.
So, and the fact that Trump chooses as his diplomatic envoys people like, common real estate tycoons in New York, or his Secretary of State basically is a neocon who doesn't know anything about foreign policy. Can you imagine that Marco Rubio knows where Kazakhstan is? He cannot point it on a map, So this qualifies his ideas, between commas, from the start. It's not serious. It's clownish.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Pat.
continue to discuss our negotiations and interactions with the Russians in public. I don't see any point to it. And I think as a result, we're going to be embarrassed somewhat by this latest ceasefire offer. If there is anything the Russians have made clear repeatedly, it's that a ceasefire in and of itself is not acceptable. They see that as simply buying time for their Ukrainian opponent to receive more weapons, equipment, cash, whatever, rebuild themselves and carry on the fight. And frankly, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that that's probably the case. So I don't know why we start with this ceasefire business. We say we want to save lives, but that's not the answer. The second thing, of course, is ending the aid. People say, well, it really doesn't matter. It'll take so long for the additional aid to reach Ukraine. What difference does it make? It makes a lot of difference if you're a Russian. If you are on the one hand saying, I want to normalize relations between my country, the United States, and Russia, I'm sincere and I'm serious about it, then why not stop the aid to people who are absolutely committed to killing Russians? That ought to be done right away. So I think that's a serious mistake. And again, this is not Donald Trump's war. He said that. He didn't want it. So why sustain the aid? That doesn't make any sense. That's not a bargaining chip. That's a self-inflicted wound. It tends to undermine the sincerity and the truth of everything he's saying. And I do believe the president when he says he wants to end the war. That's not how you end it. So at the moment, I think we're going to be disappointed. I don't see anything happening that's good.
Is the United States a neutral in the communications between and negotiations between Russia and Ukraine? Because I think it's a co-belligerent with Ukraine.
Not only are we a co-belligerent, frankly, we're responsible for the existence of this heinous regime. The hundreds of drones that struck a residential area in Moscow would not have flown anywhere were it not for us. I think that this travesty that we somehow or another are brokering something between Kiev and Moscow ought to be ended immediately. We are mightily responsible for everything that's happened in Ukraine. I think if you're a Russian, you reasonably ask the following question. If they want good relations with us, if they want to repair the damage, why don't they simply put an end to this regime in Kiev? And we could. And we could also demand that elections be held as soon as possible to put in a new government. And we could ask the Organization of Security Cooperation in Europe to help with that and get rid of Zelensky and his crew. The fact that we're not doing any of those things sends the opposite signal to the Russians. Means we're not serious and we're not sincere.
We have any leverage with the Russians whatsoever?
No, of course not. Remember, we've made this analogy before, but we probably ought to do it again, Judge. If there were a large military establishment, force, 400, 500, 600, 700,000, whatever, sitting in Mexico that was armed, trained, and equipped by the Chinese or the Russians or anybody, and its sole purpose was to attack the United States, to regain control of southern Texas or southern California or something based on what happened many, many years ago, what would we do? We would smash it. We would stop it.
Right.
And we would not negotiate with it. It's an existential threat. And we need to understand that. We have no leverage whatsoever. No one would have leverage over us in the case that we were destroying a threat in Mexico.
So are Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz and Steve Witkoff on a fool's errand?
Oh, they're on Fantasy Island. There's no question about it.
Worse than a fool's errand, I guess. I don't know what they really think they can accomplish. Let me switch.
I don't think they're going to accomplish much of anything. Although, you know, to their credit, I think the Russians will still be polite to them.
What is your view of President Putin's methodical patience? I mean, he could have, I think you've told us this, if he wanted to, demolished the invaders in Kursk. He could also demolish the government buildings in Kyiv if he wanted to.
I think he's going to work diligently to achieve the aims of his campaign: denazification, demilitarization, and hopefully set the stage for a neutral Ukraine that does not have NATO forces or any foreign forces on its soil. We should welcome that. From the very beginning, a neutral Ukraine was in everyone's interest. It put this enormous barrier, 500, 600, 700 miles between us, between NATO and Russia, in a very positive way. The opportunity for any accidents or problems that could spill over the border are almost non-existent. So, this is what he's going to do. He's going to finish that to the extent that he can. And then at the same time, I think he's going to look to us to do what we just discussed. Get Zelensky out of the picture and his little supporting cast. Stop pretending they're legitimate. Stop pretending that we have nothing to do with them. We're just sponsoring them or supporting them. That's nonsense. Get rid of them. Hold some hasty elections to the best of their ability. Put a new government in there. Let's do that. That much will help enormously. And then it's time for all the states that border Ukraine to come on board and sign the Neutrality Treaty, which should be modeled on the Austrian State Treaty. And we can certainly sign it, but we can't guarantee anything in perpetuity there because we don't live there. But the people that do live in Europe, they can have a profound impact on the survival of the agreement once it's made.
How would you advise President Trump, if you were, please God, in a position to do so, handle the Europeans? I mean, you have Sir Keir Starmer, whose military, as you've told us, wouldn't even fill Yankee Stadium.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you have President Emmanuel Macron, who does have nuclear weapons. The first nuclear weapons, I understand, are subject to approval by the Americans, some unique relationship we have with them. But how would you handle them? They seem to me to be profoundly ill-advised, a bit hot-headed, and I don't understand what they're trying to accomplish or even what they fear. But they're talking military action in Ukraine. Their people, in my view, would be blown to bits, but you're the military expert.
No, listen, you don't have to be an expert to understand that this is an empty threat. There's no support in their countries for military action against Russia. As I think I've said before, 86% of the people polled in Poland now oppose the use of Polish forces in Ukraine. Now, how are you going to get there to fight at all? It doesn't make any sense. So I think President Trump should cut his losses in Ukraine. He's a businessman. This was not an investment he made. It was made by his predecessor. It was a bad investment. Cut it. Be done with it. Then turn around to the other partners and say, you're free to do whatever you think is best. That you have your sovereignty is yours. In other words, there's nothing in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that prohibits you from doing something stupid if that's what you want to do. But I'm telling you, as President of the United States, if you go in there with the objective of fighting the Russians, you're on your own. We don't want anything to do with it. We want good relations with Russia. You should too. I would leave it at that because these governments will not survive, Judge.
Do you think these leaders, and we'll take Starmer, Merz in Germany, and Macron as examples, go to bed at night worrying that they're going to be attacked in the morning, or you think this is all domestic, politically generated?
Well, they're globalists. They think that they are supporting what they consider to be a truly righteous cause, which I think is nihilism, atheism, socialism, all bound up together in ways that are catastrophic. I don't think the populations support it. I think that's pretty obvious. I'd be surprised if the European Union survives this whole adventure. We know NATO won't. That's inevitable. And these things happen over time. It's better if you have some foresight and you can manage the dissolution of these things. But we don't live in the world of 80, 90 years ago. And the notion of building alliances or structuring anything that triggers an automatic war for the American people doesn't make any sense. So we definitely need to get out of these places. And I would just, if I were the president, I would simply say what I did. I don't think these governments will last. I think Starmer is on borrowed time. Macron is about as popular as the plague in France. I think the French and the British will dispose of them. Now, Merz just got in there. And the Germans, as you know, these are very conservative people. They will wait to see what he does, and they will discover that he is another globalist. He's another manifestation of the old problem. And the Germans will eventually throw him out. It just takes the Germans longer. Things usually begin in France, but they don't begin in Germany.
Here's Secretary of State Rubio in Ireland yesterday. I'd like your thoughts on this. Chris, cut number one.
Are you truly prepared to apply pressure on Russia should it be recalcitrant and not agree to the terms of the ceasefire? There's been no concrete action that this administration has taken to punish Russia since it's come to office.
There's a couple points. To be clear, as far as I am aware, the United States has not provided armaments to Russia. The United States is not providing assistance to Russia. Every single sanction that has been imposed on Russia remains in place. Every single sanction the president inherited remains in place. Right, but well, I mean, they're pretty sanctioned up. I mean, there's a lot of sanctions on already. My point being is that there's been no steps taken to relieve any of these things. These things continue to be in place, but we don't think it's constructive for me to stand here today and begin to issue threats about what we're going to do if Russia says no. Let's hope they say yes.
Say yes to what? To giving the 30 days to regroup and rearm?
Trump owns his reputation in Russia.
I think Senator Rubio or Secretary of State Rubio is in a difficult position now. We have no leverage. Threatening the Russians with more of what we've already done is not going to have an impact. They have found a way to survive the sanctions regime. In fact, you can argue that they flourished as a result. We've actually strengthened this whole BRICS system that is evolving by imposing sanctions. We are seen as so hostile and so belligerent. The view is that with the United States, it's their way or the highway. And the world doesn't want to play in that ballpark anymore. So the bottom line is he's telling you the truth. We've already done all that we can, and it doesn't make sense. They'll say yes. Well, that's a stupid remark because they're not going to say yes. We know what the conditions are. How many times do they have to repeat themselves? And we can help this along. We can accelerate the end of this war, or we can cause it to last longer. And it looks like we've decided to postpone any fundamental change and let it continue.
We talked a few minutes ago about the Europeans in my interview with Foreign Minister Lavrov on Monday. He said a number of fascinating things. A 2-hour interview. I think he did 95% of the talking. That's just the way he is. I'm deeply grateful for having been there. But here's an interesting comment he made, Colonel, about his belief, and I assume President Putin's belief, that the Europeans actually want more war. Chris, cut number 10.
Prime Minister of Denmark. She said that these days Ukraine is weak. Ukraine cannot be fairly treated now. Therefore, for Ukraine, today, peace is worse than war. She said this. Let's pump Ukraine with weapons again, and when we have shaken Russian position, then let's see whether we can talk. And the chief of German intelligence a couple of days ago said that it would be bad for Ukraine and for Europe if the war ends before 2029. And 2030 even better. Yes, they say these things. And when President Trump was interrogating President Zelensky in the Oval Office, asking him many times, "You don't want to negotiate. Zelensky was trying to avoid the nonsense.
Were you startled to hear those comments from the Prime Minister of Denmark? Peace is worse than war. From the head of German intelligence, it would be good if the war lasted to 2029, 2030. The guffaws in the background were mine. I was startled to hear that. I was seated just across the table from him at the time.
Well, these people are lunatics. Let's not even discuss lunacy at this point. Let's just say Prime Minister Salisbury of Great Britain, one of Britain's best prime ministers, frankly, once observed that the biggest mistake in politics is to cling to the carcass of dead policies. The Ukraine policy, the policy of arming Ukraine to the teeth and hurling it at Russia, is dead. It was a mistake. It should never have happened. These people are clinging to it. If they insist on doing so, their voting electorates will turn them out. There's no question about it. Now, secondly, when you listen to the Prime Minister of Denmark, I've listened to, I think, the lady leading Estonia, another Prime Minister in Finland, or President. These people have lost all sense of proportionality. They don't know what war is. All of these people do not understand war. They haven't looked carefully at what's gone on in Ukraine. This is the kind of war that can be brought to them if they insist on persisting in this hostility to Russia at a point in time where Russia is not interested in hostility to them. I mean, this is the real tragedy here. We're not dealing with a Stalinist Russia that is bent on territorial conquest and expansion. There is no common turn. That's ridiculous nonsense. If anybody has something like the common turn, it's USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy. Those things are gone. They've got to wake up and come to terms with reality. And as long as we seem to be allied with them and underwrite them, they will behave stupidly. It's the same problem with Zelensky. That's why President Trump needs to say to them, if this is what you want, you are on your own. You will get nothing from us. And this notion that we have some holy obligation to do anything the European leadership wants us to do is ridiculous. It's nonsense. We came there after World War II and we stayed because of the threat that was represented by the Soviet Union. It's all gone. There's no reason for us to be there now. That's not contemporary Russia. They need to wake up and get on with things.
Switching to the Middle East, Colonel, the Israelis have stopped all food, water, medicine, and electricity into Gaza. President Trump has dispatched Steve Witkoff, the same Witkoff that we mentioned a few minutes ago, because he's also going to Moscow to negotiate directly with Hamas over the severe but not publicly revealed objections of Prime Minister Netanyahu and the right-wing cabal around him. Not too long ago, you warned about the likelihood of a regional war in the Middle East. Do you still have that view, Colonel?
Oh, absolutely. And by the way, just to backtrack a little bit, if we do not act in a more sober and realistic manner towards Moscow, the war in Ukraine could also unravel in Eastern Europe. So I think it's very important that we act swiftly to put an end to the fantasy island trip that these people in Great Britain or Denmark or France are on. That should end as soon as possible. In the Middle East, there are many potential triggers that could lead to a regional civil war. I've mentioned this before. There's something called Abbasiyya, which is a word that seems to mean in the Muslim world a sense of solidarity, a coalition or coherence of Islamic peoples. That's always been very weak in the past, but that's changing. if Mr. Netanyahu does what I think he will do and resumes bombing in Gaza, that will bring Egypt into conflict with Israel. When that happens, all bets are off. The entire region is going to gear up and go to war with Israel in some form or another. It may not happen in the first 24 hours, but it will spread. The same thing is true in southern Syria. If the Israelis are only perhaps 30 kilometers from Damascus right now, insist on annexing all of that territory, inevitably they will confront the Turks. The Turkish military will confront them. That's not going to be tolerated. Damascus is one of the great cities of Islam. The idea of the Israelis marching into it is anathema to every Muslim. They've already lost Jerusalem. Cairo is the other great city, and then Damascus in the modern world. They're not going to give those up. So I think it's a question of where does this begin? What triggers it? What causes it? What about a Turkish confrontation with the Israelis at sea? I don't know. And then, of course, there is Iran. And Iran has pledged support to Egypt, as has Saudi Arabia. And I think the Iranians will stand by Egypt. And if Egypt gets into a war with Israel, they will be supported by Iran. The whole thing is a house of cards that could collapse very suddenly and then erupt in fire. And the fire will not contain itself. It will spread and spread and spread. So the only solution at this point for the President of the United States is to rein in Mr. Netanyahu, which I think he will not do under any circumstances.
The one question that I put to Foreign Minister Lavrov, which he chose not to answer, Colonel, was if the Israelis bomb Iran, will Russia come militarily to Iran's defense? He just sort of looked at me with a little bit of a smile and went on to finish answering a previous question. He chose not to address that. Do you think Russia will come to Iran's defense if the Israelis attack Iran, particularly with American assistance?
Well, the short answer is yes, I do. I think Russia, China, Iran, all the states in the Middle East, and beyond that, frankly, in the world, many, many other nation states are watching all of this. And I think they've concluded that a failure to act against Israeli aggression and against us, if we directly join Israeli aggression, will lead to their own destruction. You know, at some point, no matter how weak you may feel or be, you decide that it is no longer in your interest to do nothing. And frankly, the Arabs for a very long time have taken the position, it's in our interest to do nothing. That's no longer the case. I think the Arab states understand at this point it's do or die. And right now, the two leading powers in the region who are prepared to act against Israel and us if necessary are Egypt and Iran. So I think the Russians understand it, the Chinese understand it. You've seen the Russian-Chinese naval drills off the coast of the Straits of Hormuz. That's not an empty gesture. That's a very real statement. And I think we can expect more of that as the time goes on. So that's why my great concern at this point is the only person, the only individual who has the authority and the power to intervene and stop this is Donald Trump. But I don't think he will do that. I think he's caught up in a web of his, not necessarily of his making, a web that constrains him in terms of what actions he can execute.
Colonel, you and I have a mutual friend who used to appear on this show and now has his own, Colonel Daniel Davis, who recently, the director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, announced she was going to appoint him as a deputy director, a position for which I think, in your view and mine, he is eminently qualified. What happened to Colonel Davis when Director Gabbard announced she was going to appoint him?
I think a number of things happened. Keep in mind that whether you like or dislike Dan Davis, I happen to like him. This is someone who is always scrupulously honest in all of his dealings. This is a person who absolutely rejects deceit and is a man of complete integrity. In addition to that, he has great courage, not just physical courage on the battlefield, which he demonstrated back in 1991 because I was able to see it. He also has moral courage. He's willing to stand up to those who are doing things that he thinks are wrong. What he's done that has deeply offended the people that control Washington is that he has said he cannot support what the Israelis are doing in Gaza, that this is inhumane and it is beyond the pale for him as an American and as a Christian to support this. That's unacceptable today in Washington, D.C. Everyone in Washington, D.C., with very few exceptions, has decided for personal reasons that they are going to support whatever Mr. Netanyahu's government wants to do, regardless of how many deaths that means among the populations of Gaza, or for that matter, the West Bank, or ultimately anywhere else in the region. Unconditional support for whatever he wants to do. That's something that Dan can't publicly do. And he's honest about it. And I think that's done him in. And it's unfortunate that we've reached a point now where that's the attitude. It's not a healthy one for the United States.
It's very sad. You and I and our colleagues on this show were harshly critical of the influence that the Israeli lobby had in the Biden administration. It apparently has the same influence in the Trump administration.
Well, John Mearsheimer has talked about that in great detail, and I certainly would defer to him. That's not something I've studied in detail as he has. But let's keep in mind that money buys a lot inside the Beltway, and that's not a new development. It's always had an enormous impact. There are reasons people want to sit on certain committees. You know, the Securities Banking Exchange Committee in the House is a good example. You go there, you are someone who is in a position to interact with the banks, and they find ways to reward you for your support of their interests. This is an old game. It's nothing new. It's just better organized and more subversive, I suppose, to our foreign policy and our defense than ever before in the history of our country.
Colonel McGregor, thank you very much. Thank you for your time, for your insight, for your personal courage.
Hekmat, I wanted you to respond to the dominant Western media narrative that we're getting, which is that, you know, this is basically the HTS government responding to ambushes by what is called Assad loyalists. All the people who are being targeted are quote unquote Assad loyalists. And, you know, one of the outlets that adopted this narrative is Democracy Now! And I'm showing this just because this highlights that even at the dissenting end of the spectrum in the US, we get this uniform narrative, even from people who should be challenging establishment propaganda, not parroting it.
News from Syria, at least 70 people were killed, dozens more wounded in overnight clashes between Syrian forces and fighters loyal to the deposed leader Bashar al-Assad. Dozens of Syrian authorities were targeted in various ambush attacks by Assad loyalists in the Latakia and Tartus provinces, which have long been strongholds for Assad's toppled government.
So there we go. This is the government now is responding to ambushes by Assad loyalists in the strongholds of the Assad government. So basically, this is all just being done by people who want to bring back Bashar al-Assad, and that's what all this is about.
Yeah, well, Amy Goodman also partially to blame for this Western narrative that connected the crimes of the Assad family to the Alawites en masse. But that's beside the point. They've done essentially a Hezbollah trick of cutting off the scale of escalation right when it's convenient. As I said at the start of the stream, there are a clear set of escalations that have led to this point. the Alawites, some of them, the majority of them, believed the promises of the HTS government when they took power in the 8th of December, and large proportions of them laid down their guns and their armaments, trusting in that promise that they're going to be able to have a dignified life and they're not going to be subjected to sectarian-based provocations and aggression. But that's just not turned out to be true. As I showed before, and as I shared in some X posts here, this is a clear outcome from a gradually increasing set of escalations against the Alawite communities in the west of Syria. So you had already 14 people killed in February 27th. You had February 27th, we saw 4 people in CCTV footage that every single person in Syria saw. Just 4 men being executed summarily in their own store, their grocery store. And you've seen a lot of kidnappings, a lot of aggression against the Alawite community, where some leaders of the Alawite community decided that we need to protect ourselves. We need to potentially try and get some deal in this ongoing balkanization of the Syrian state, where we could potentially get leverage, get cards on the table to get some sort of an autonomous region that is Alawite. You got to remember this, you have 3 to 4 million Alawites. They are now living in a country and under a government that considers them, in the worst case scenario, considers them pigs and apostates, and in the best case scenario, considers them second-class citizens who are all responsible for the crimes of the last 14 years against the other parts of the Syrian people, the Syrian community. So under international law, they're allowed to seek out some sort of independence or sovereignty. They're allowed to protect themselves against incursions from other entities in the same country. And one last point that everyone neglects to mention: yes, we've been through a horrible 14-year civil war that's been proxy war, a bloody war, but in transitional justice, as it's defined by the United Nations and the precedent that was established by the United Nations, you either have amnesty for all or you have justice for all. You can't pick and choose. You can't choose that you're going to come with daggers for revenge against the Alawite community and decide to lay ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all of their supporters off the hook. That's just not how it's going to work for the future of the Syrian people themselves will never accept that. So you're not going to, it's impossible to make that argument. That argument falls flat when you recognize the facts on the ground.
Yeah, the hatred of Alawites has been inculcated into Syria through this into the Sunni population through the poisonous broadcasts emerging from the Gulf since the so-called Arab Spring. And you have like Yusuf al-Qaradawi, the favorite of Al Jazeera Arabic, who is saying Alawites are infidels, like the worst infidels, like the worst possible infidels. I can just go on YouTube and find, if I look up like the origins of the Alawi sect, I'm going to find so many Sunni preachers just denouncing them, delivering hour-long lectures on what repugnant animals they are and all the hideous practices that they proliferate across Syria. And then they claim they're not pushing sectarianism. I mean, and that's just in English for like a YouTube audience. It's not even like regulated there. But it's been ever since the Gulf states started really pushing their influence in Syria, a social poison, and now it's playing out before our eyes. Will this spread to attacks on the Christian population of Syria and actually start getting the US to care? Because no one seems to care about the Alawites in the West or anywhere else.
Yeah.
Here's one post, by the way. Here's this one post just from X, Twitter. They're now looting Alawite and Christian stores and houses after having killed off entire villages and cities. And again, we can't confirm exactly what is real and what's not, because a lot of things can be said. But I mean, it's just, I'm getting all kinds of claims like this from people that I know inside Syria. It just sounds really, really ugly. And of course, our media will do a terrible job of covering this because they've been whitewashing this for more than a decade. It's true that when Christians are attacked, that gets more attention in the West because that's just so much harder to suppress, given that, you know, a lot of the US is a Christian culture. But even that has been totally whitewashed too. And it's so cynical. The US spends billions of dollars in a secret, dirty war that is barely covered. The New York Times had a couple of stories on it. Western media barely acknowledges it. Then you have the crippling sanctions, which are like the invisible killer, which no one ever acknowledges. They're still ongoing now. Some of the people who, as Max talked about, were responsible for those sanctions now want to have them removed, but it's not happening. And so they're continuing to tear this country apart. And in that situation, and when you have a government that's ruled by the former leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria and former deputy leader of ISIS, of course you're going to have sectarianism. Of course
This is a helicopter attack on an Alawite neighborhood.
And what do we get, you know, when we would criticize the sectarian nature of the insurgency? Like, what were we called? We were called
Islamophobes.
Yeah, which is like saying you're an anti-Semite if you're critical of the Jewish supremacist state. To criticize Al-Qaeda is not to be Islamophobic, it's just to criticize sectarian fanaticism that slaughters people because they're of a different sect, which is what not all the Syrian insurgency, but the dominant strain of it has been. And now they're in power, and now they're empowered to go and carry out sectarian slaughters like we're seeing right now.
That was like the weaponization of Islamophobia, the same way that Zionists weaponize anti-Semitism. It was being weaponized by Muslim Zionists who want to exist in a multicultural reality in the West where they are respected and have equal civil and religious rights, while forming a religious supremacist state in a country far away that might have been their country of origin or not. You know, I remember a lot of like Pakistani American journalists and activists calling me an Islamophobe for criticizing the Syrian opposition. They weren't even Syrian, but it's Muslim Zionism, and the weaponization of that term is just being exposed. It's as completely hollow right now because this is what we were warning about, and none of them, most of them, certainly not the Sorosy professional activist types from foundation-backed fake activist NGOs, certainly not the Trotskyist academic types and grad students. Those types who denounced us over the past few years have nothing to say about this right now. It's like not even on their radar.
Yeah, they just move on to the next hustle, the next like regime change, proxy war hustle, which, you know, like right now is Ukraine, and they forget about the countries that they took part in cheering for the destruction of. I mean, that's what happened to Syria. In cheering on the proxy war, you were cheering on the country's destruction.
Well, those are the people that divided the Palestine Solidarity movement because they were like the liberal class, the NGO class that infested that movement, and they all, you know, a lot of them might support BDS and they'll march for Palestine, but ultimately they're empire flunkies and they support the same system, the same imperial system that has doomed Palestine. So they've maybe momentarily moved on to Palestine for now. Some of them did have, Ukraine flags and Palestine flags in their bios. No names, but they support Palestine simply from a liberal perspective, that it's just a human rights issue. It's not an issue of imperialism. And now they're silent. They're totally silent. There's nothing they can say. The only people you hear from are like the really sectarian Ikhwan types. But Hekmat, feel free to weigh in here.
Yeah. The rhetoric online has become a dead space in the middle with a robust, extreme, like fascist Sunni right that I can describe, just out in the open in Arabic, calling for the extermination of minorities, primarily Alawites. And then some in the extreme far left of this spectrum, making some amends, trying to call out the violence, trying to call for, I recognize that we live under HES, Al-Qaeda rule, but we need to figure out a way for us to build this country together, like living high, head in the sky, not really recognizing the situation. But the overwhelming majority is happening on that robust, almost fascistic approach to Syria, where it's just vilifying their fellow compatriots and seeing them as lesser than, seeing them as pigs, and calling for the purification of their lands, of their towns, their cities, their neighborhoods. Yeah, I wanted to add something. I sent you the aftermath, if you want, in the last link of one of those bombs or barrel bombs or these indiscriminate yeah. Where's yeah, where's Charles Lister? Where are the folks?
Where's
from
Ken
the
Roth,
Where's
former
Ken?
permanent leader of Human Rights Watch?
This looks indiscriminate to me.
Is Clarissa
and it
Ward
looks-
going to rush to the scene and find dismembered bodies or survivors? Where's Clarissa Ward?
Yeah. So yeah, that's the situation on the ground right now. There's another clip that I sent you. It's this almost fascistic interpretation of Islam that is now roaming around the streets of Syria. If you want to play the clip, and I can translate, there's translation in the bio of the clip. But growing up in Syria, whenever I would go to, like, I'll have my basketball practice in Aleppo, or I'll have, I'll go on a hike, or I'll go on a walk with some friends. During the month of Ramadan, I could eat in the streets if I wanted to. I can drink water. Sometimes I'll get some looks, but I wasn't gonna get met with the reaction that you see in this Twitter post that I shared with you, the one labeled Ramadan.
Is this it?
Yeah, now it's become the norm for some of these HTS jihadis. In some other videos, it's Uyghurs, it's Turkmenistanis, it's Tajiks and Uzbeks walking around the streets of the cities that they are coming in as guests or supposed liberators, and enforcing forced fasting, forced public fasting, telling people that in the month of Ramadan, they're not allowed to smoke, they're not allowed to eat, they're not allowed to drink water. This is just not how the Syrian society existed for the last 70 years of its existence up until this moment. We have a mosaic of different cultures and sects, and people in this pluralistic society lived and coexisted, sometimes. But this is now the norm. Patrols with AK-47s next to your passenger seat, ready to intimidate anyone who's just smoking or eating or drinking in the streets.
All right, so go ahead. Let me turn down the volume and you can translate this.
Yeah, he's telling him, put down the smoke. He's asking him to be ashamed of himself for smoking and or potentially eating in the streets in the middle of the Ramadan. Yeah, keep watching this video, actually. He comes back for his AK-47 to intimidate this person. The guy who's smoking asks him, the guy who's smoking, the second guy who's smoking, asks him, like, are you part of the security forces to tell me to put down my smoke? And then the guy says, yes, I am, and goes back in to reach for his AK-47. So this is the situation on the ground. Added to it, desecration of Christian cemeteries, desecration of Alawite tombs and places of worship, Kurds being mistreated, Druze being mistreated. So it's just outrageously imbecilic of the HTS government. If you want to keep this country, if you want to keep the country that you became the leadership of from balkanizing, this is just not the way you should run things. This is the opposite of how you should run things if you don't want Israel to show up and allow for a Druze protectorate state to develop in the south, and for the David corridor to protect the Kurds in the south, in the northeast, and for a potential even Alawite state to form under a protectorate of Israelis or Russian protection in the west. So yeah, it's just asinine.
Yeah, I mean, I'm seeing, you see tons of reports every day about, teachers being fired for wearing makeup. In Idlib for years before Turkey came in and established full control, colorful hijab was not just frowned upon, it was outlawed. effectively outlawed, along with the public playing of music, pop music, and so on. Things brightened up a little when Turkey came in. But now that's being imposed sort of arbitrarily in areas that HTS controls in Syria. It's not something they can really market to the outside world in the much needed campaign to end sanctions. Sanctions really do need to end. And you've got like Muaz Mustafa, who's Salim Qasim's boss, who was a major player. Like sort of, he was like the liaison in DC for Congress and all politicians who wanted to impose sanctions on Syria and destroy Syria. He was like their Sherpa. And now he's trying to end sanctions because he got the opposition in control. And he's bringing Jewish Syrians to Congress because from sort of an anti-Semitic point of view, Jews are the best way to appeal to the Trump administration and the Republicans. But if you look at the reality on the ground, it's not something that the forces in control in Washington are going to want to reward by rolling back sanctions. It is a disastrous situation.
Yeah, again, I don't think they care about the sectarian violence. It happened for 14 years and no one batted an eye. It's going to happen. And it's just currently, as I said before, currently Trump is in a bind because I said this yesterday on a show. He's like a fat woman or a fat man who wants to get on a diet, but the one thing he can't avoid is butter. Like he wants to pull out of the Middle East, but the one thing he cannot say no to is Bibi's demands. And Bibi is now telling him that you want to keep sanctions on Syria. You want to keep the pressure on Syria so that we can negotiate, so we can have the best deal possible with this newly minted Al-Qaeda government. And they have all the way. So why not? If you put yourself from their perspective, they have all the leverage. So we're not going to see real sanctions relief. So we saw some to symbolize some potential investors that there could be some change down the line in the future. But the real sanctions relief from Washington, I don't think is going to come until Israel gets everything it wants on a long list of demands, whether it pertains to like a southern protectorate for the Druze, a David corridor for the Kurds, full and complete unconditional normalization with the Syrian government, the hitherto last sovereign state that had its own independent decision and its own independent army on its border. And if it doesn't get 100% of this list, when it's in this amazing, very strong position to negotiate, I don't think the sanctions will be removed in a real way.
Total catastrophe. And Aaron, for those watching, Aaron had to go. My last question is, where is Bashar al-Assad in all this? He's being accused by supporters of HTS of somehow puppeteering this, but he's in Moscow. And, when he arrived there, it took several days for him to even get a meeting with President Putin. That was it was a short meeting. It was like an hour. And it's unclear to me what influence or cards he still holds or what role he plays. Where does he fit into this scenario?
Yeah, from my reading, he holds no cards. He's just on house arrest in Moscow because the Russians have made their calculations. They've made their decisions, and they hold no sympathy or empathy for Assad. One thing that I noted is that his son Hafiz, after introducing this entire fiasco, when he published that video, that pretty stupid video of him walking down the streets and showing everyone where he was living in Moscow.
Yeah.
After that video, that Telegram channel and those social media channels have been quiet. And there's been some fake reports that someone is in contact with him, but I don't think anyone is in contact in a real way with the Bashar dynasty that is now safely kept away, locked away in a nice golden cage in Moscow, is my read.
We heard very little from him during the Gaza genocide. There was not, Syria was keeping quiet. They were hosting or allowing arms to flow to Hezbollah and to the axis of resistance. But Syria was always kind of the weakest link in the axis of resistance.
Yeah.
And now it's being balkanized. I haven't seen any reporters interview Assad. I don't think he's been heard from.
Yeah, of course, interviewers, of course, journalists want to interview him, and of course, thousands of like writers and reporters and biographers want to go and get a book deal from him. But I don't think the Russians will allow that.
Well, I haven't tried my luck, although I've been called an Assadist for opposing the devious, diabolical process that led to this point for Syria, which was run largely or heavily by my own government. But it just seems like it's not even an issue. This one man is not even an issue anymore. The issue is the underlying power dynamics in the region and the predatory relationship between the imperial countries and their allies and Syria and what's left of Syria. And it also seems like nobody really cares. Like very few, even in alternative media, this isn't really being discussed anymore. It was like, all right, that happened. Assad's gone. Let's call it a day. We're going to keep talking about it.
Max, before we close, can you share the image I sent you on Telegram? It's a family friend of ours. We're trying to bring up attention. He was kidnapped since February 2nd, and we have no clue where he is. And I'm just trying to do what I can to build up some pressure so that maybe some devious person in Damascus is watching this and realizes that there's some reporting on him. Can you just share that picture?
1 second.
Yeah, his name is Musa Dahi. He was a very close family friend of ours. He, carried was a pallbearer with me when I carried the coffin of my grandfather in Syria 2 years ago. He's a very close family friend, and he's been disappeared for the last almost a month and a half. And we were in contact with one potential group that was holding him, an armed militia. We sent them $5K, and then they just ghosted us. So we don't have any proof of life. We don't have any information. If anyone knows, to get in contact with me on Twitter or on Telegram or something. Yeah, that's all.
I'm sorry to hear that. You're not the first friend of mine with ties to Syria who's been dealing with trying to locate family members. One friend of mine had a family member who the extended family thought that they had been in one of the Syrian government's prisons under Assad. Never found her in any of the prisons when they were emptied, and now have concluded that one of Jolani's gangs actually took her. Yeah. That's what so many Syrians are going through. Well, as I said, we're going to continue to cover this. The world needs to know what's happening, because as Hekmat said, if this were happening to any other group in any other country, maybe not any other country or any other group, but what's taking place right now could have triggered a responsibility to protect operation by the West if the victims were worthy of the West.
Months ago.
If they could have been weaponized for geopolitical purposes. But right now, nobody cares about the Alawites. And it would have happened months ago.
Of the day. In this episode, we're going to have a look at Kursk because more things have happened, and we have some statements from none other than Mr. Syrski. Grab the popcorn for that one. Then we have the green t-shirt. Ever since that humiliation in the Oval Office, he was silent. Well, as silent as he could have been. But now he's found his voice again, and he's basically demanding that the United States puts pressure on Russia to accept his terms of the ceasefire. And then we have the European Union, who has put out a long statement. Don't worry, I'm not going to put you through all of that, but I've just selected 3 paragraphs, which I think we need to take a look at. So, with that said, let us go to Ukrainska Pravda. I'm also going to show you an updated map. Well, it's not fully updated, but it's close, just to see what's happening in Kursk and what happened over the last 48 hours. Ukrainian forces retreating in Russia's Kursk Oblast, but not withdrawing altogether, sources say. Ukrainska Pravda has learned that some Ukrainian units, particularly airborne troops, remain in Kursk Oblast and are being pulled back closer to the Russo-Ukrainian border, but not beyond it. Ukrainian soldiers were still holding Sudzha as of 12 p.m. on the 12th of March, as reported by Ukrainska Pravda sources. As of 4 p.m., there was no confirmation of a complete withdrawal from the town. Well, those sources that Ukrainska Pravda has are not genuine, because all the evidence, the video evidence, suggests that Ukraine was not holding jack nothing in Sudzha. Yes, they still had a presence, reportedly, as I stated yesterday, in the eastern district of Sudzha, but they were not holding. You know, when you're holding something in military terms, it means that you control it. They couldn't have controlled anything because the Russians were already in the center and they were taking pictures with the flags. But again, these are Ukrainska Pravda sources. But you don't worry, because if you think this is sugarcoating, let's just wait until we get to Mr. Syrsky. He will give us a lesson in how to sugarcoat things. As of the 12th of March, the Ukrainian grouping in Kursk Oblast is not encircled, but the situation remains fragile, largely dependent on maintaining control of a key road for troop movement. They're saying that the Ukrainian forces are not encircled in Kursk Oblast. Don't even think about it. But at the same time, they're telling you, well, actually, everything depends upon one road. Well, would you be comfortable with those odds? If you think this is bad, just wait until we get to Mr. Syrsky. Ukraine's commander-in-chief, defense forces will hold the line in Russia's Kursk Oblast and maneuver if necessary. Quote, in the most difficult situations, my priority has been and remains the preservation of Ukrainian soldiers' lives. For this reason, defense forces units, if necessary, conduct maneuvers to more advantageous positions, as in they're retreating. The primary means used are drones and artillery firepower. I have issued all necessary orders for this. So Mr. Syrsky is saying that the Ukrainian soldiers in Kursk will hold the line. Let me put the map on the screen, just so you can visualize what I'm about to say. Imagine 3 different lines here. Which one will Ukraine hold? There was about 3 different lines, about 10 kilometers apart from each other. Which one will Ukraine hold? This is the problem with the propaganda. Another thing that he says is that the Ukrainian forces in Kursk will conduct maneuvers if necessary. Oh yes, I have no doubt about it. Back towards Ukraine, that's the direction of those maneuvers. The problem is with people who don't want to accept reality, and this is also very dangerous, and is very dangerous for the Ukrainian soldiers, because the leadership just cannot accept the reality. But he goes on. Despite the increased pressure from the Russian and North Korean troops, we will hold the line in Kursk Oblast for as long as it remains reasonable and necessary. The word necessary is the one that raises the most questions. Why was it necessary in the first place? What has this operation have accomplished for Ukraine? What is the benefit? What do you have to show for it? What possible tactical advantage did you gain from this? And of course, the answer is nothing. It was PR points, stunts, just gobble up more support for the green t-shirt. Look, we are winning, we are doing strong, we are taking the war to Russia. And of course, it failed, it was a disaster, but now they can't bring themselves to admit it. Let us move to the green t-shirt. Zelensky expects strong steps from US if Russia refuses ceasefire. When journalists asked Zelensky what the US would do if Russia did not agree to the steps agreed upon during the meeting of the US and the Ukrainian delegations in Saudi Arabia, he said he expected strong steps. Strong steps towards the Russian side. I understand that we can count on strong steps. I don't know the details yet, but we are talking about sanctions and strengthening Ukraine. So let me see if I've got this straight. Ukraine, the losing side, and the United States, their master puppeteer, have agreed upon some terms of an imaginary ceasefire without Russia. And Zelensky says, well, Russia now must absolutely accept the terms of the ceasefire that us, the losing side, and our master proxy have actually agreed upon. Does this make any sort of sense? Of course it doesn't. But of course he then goes further and says, I expect strong steps. Russia is not exactly going to take into account what Ukraine and the United States have discussed. I mean, sure, it's a good baseline just to understand the positions of each nation. But at the end of the day, the ceasefire, the peace talks, whatever emerges at the end of this conflict will not be dictated by the losing side. I keep saying this, I keep beating the same drum, but there was no example in history when the losing side has set the terms of a ceasefire or of peace or of anything like that. When you're losing, you're the one having to agree with things. But you know, Mr. Zelensky, the green t-shirt, he's still in an imaginary world where he dictates the red lines and the conditions and he gives ultimatums because somebody backs him up. Also, the green t-shirt is saying that unless Russia agrees to this ceasefire, well, in that case, the United States will strengthen Ukraine. Can we just ask how exactly? Because giving more weapons, more financial aid, more of this and more of that is not going to fix the problem. They've had the United States weapons, they've had the United States financial aid, they've had the Europeans and everybody else's. And still, here we are. This is the situation. Ukraine, like I keep saying for about 7 months, it doesn't just have a problem with money, equipment, and ammunition. It's also a manpower shortage problem. And that is something that the United States cannot fix. The Europeans can't fix. Even they themselves in Ukraine can't address. That's the problem. This is just a show. It's just a PR move. It's all about who looks good at the camera. But it's a lot of packaging, zero substance. Let us move on to the next and final article about the European Union. European Parliament opposes forcing Ukraine into capitulation under guise of peace agreement. Quote, the European Parliament deplores any attempts at blackmailing Ukraine's leadership into surrender to the Russian aggressor for the sole purpose of announcing a so-called peace deal. This is clearly a dig at Donald Trump. It couldn't be more obvious even if they tried, because they themselves say that Donald Trump only chases personal accolades, even at the expense of Ukraine. And of course, the European Union, in their infinite sanctimony, they can't just allow that to happen. You know, the European Union, they're the guardians of the good. So, according to them, a peace is not enough. It has to be just, sustainable, you know, all those adjectives. But in reality, what is really going on here is that the European Union and not just the EU as an institution, but also the European leaders, they don't want to admit that they lost. Simply put, this is a time-buying exercise. And if you're wondering, what are they trying to buy time for? Well, the answer is quite simple. They know that when the curtain is finally about to drop and reality will stare them in their faces, Ukraine would have lost, and so will the European Union. And they want to make sure that they have the structures in place in Europe in order to keep themselves in power, even against the inevitable backlash. That's what this is all about. They're all trying to buy just a few more weeks, a few more months. This is why they're escalating the rhetoric, because they need to give themselves reasons to create more institutions, more branches of power, more military, more this, more that. Let's continue. The MEP stated that taking into account the history of Russia's violations of previous agreements and fundamental principles of international law, such a peace can only be reached through strength, including effective security guarantees. Additionally, MEPs urged the European Union to accelerate Ukraine's accession negotiations and call for the confiscation of Russian sovereign assets frozen under EU sanctions to be used for Ukraine's defense and reconstruction. But of course, the plan is not to use those assets for Ukraine's reconstruction, but for Europe's reconstruction. Because nobody wants to talk about how much money Europe has spent with this conflict. And there's no way to make that money back, unless they put their hand in the cookie jar and help themselves with the Russian frozen assets. That's what the plan is really all about. But again, they need a little bit more time to get there. because they don't have the legal framework to seize that money. They could sanction it, they could freeze it, but they can't confiscate it. That's the problem. They all keep saying that it's about helping Ukraine, when in fact the only people they're trying to help is themselves. They try to help themselves stay in power for just 5 minutes longer. Don't let anything get in the way, you know? My friends, I'll end this episode here. I wish you a really good rest of the day, and I'll see you tomorrow in the next video update. Take care.
Syracuse, Atlantic City, Levittown, New York, Cohost, New York, Providence, Rhode Island, San Jose, Toledo, and Bakersfield. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets. Trump halted military aid and intelligence sharing to Kiev, and now he's reversing it. Just because Zelensky agreed to a 30-day ceasefire, when he knows there's not a snowball's chance in hell that Russia would agree when they're making major gains in Kursk. Is Trump joking? Here we go.
Those talks that happen in Saudi Arabia are being treated as if they were successful, because it's being reported that in exchange for Kiev agreeing to a 30-day ceasefire with Russia, that the US has decided to lift its ban on military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine. Now, I guess this shouldn't come as too much of a surprise based on the initial commentary, right? When we had the initial report saying that these things were being halted, the Trump administration officials that commented on this were very careful with their wording. They said, oh, it's a temporary pause on intelligence sharing, right? It's a temporary halt to military aid. And they kind of put it out there that their goal at the moment was to really put pressure on Zelensky and his government to get them to act in the way that the Trump administration wanted, to get them to want to pursue peace. And you're telling me that you put all of that pressure on them and now you're willing to undo all of it because they agreed to a 30-day ceasefire? Like, is no one in the Trump administration paying attention here? And I just love the idea that the US is going to approach Russia and that they are going to tell them, hey, we've got Ukraine to agree to a 30-day ceasefire. Look at how smart and how great we are. And Russia is going to look at them and go, hey, we're on the brink of not only retaking the Kursk region, right, wiping out Kiev's forces there, but we're also on the brink of approaching key towns in the Donbass region. Why would we agree to a 30-day ceasefire? Like, are you kidding me? Not only would that keep Russia from being able to advance at a time when it's making significant movement on the ground, but it also, because as a reminder, what did Kiev just get? Oh, they got a lifting on the pause of military aid from the US. So the US is literally saying, let's stop fighting for 30 days and we're going to send Kiev more military aid. So the exact thing that Russia has been saying this entire time that is unacceptable to them, which is a frozen conflict in which these NATO members are able to rearm and to rebuild Kiev's military. That is the thing that Russia has been saying, and now that's the thing that the US is proposing.
So what is in it for Putin to go along with this, I guess, is the bigger question. US-backed ceasefire offer poses dilemma for Putin. He recently rejected the idea of an interim truce in Ukraine, but he wants to maintain his relationship with President Trump. So as recently as January, President Vladimir Putin of Russia emphatically rejected the idea of a temporary ceasefire in Ukraine. But after a month in which President Trump turned American foreign policy on his head and Russian forces made progress in a key battle, the Kremlin now appears keen, at least to entertain the 30-day ceasefire proposal made by Ukraine and the United States on Tuesday. Does Trump have secret plans to whack Zelensky? But that would be a tragedy. Dmitry S. Peskov, Mr. Putin's spokesman, told reporters on Wednesday that the Kremlin was carefully studying the outcome of Tuesday's talks between the United States and Ukraine and their call for a month-long ceasefire. He said he expected the United States to inform Russia in the coming days of the details of the negotiations that took place and the understandings that were reached. So he raised the possibility of another phone call between Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump, signaling that the Kremlin saw the ceasefire proposal as just part of a broader flurry of diplomacy. Mr. Putin has seen a dizzying reversal in his geopolitical fortunes over the last month as Mr. Trump realigned American foreign policy in Russia's favor, antagonized U.S. allies, and excoriated President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine at the White House. So a dizzying reversal of fortune? So you're saying he stopped winning the war because he's been winning that war? Well, I don't understand. What is the reversal of fortune? He's been winning the war. You mean the reversal of fortune with President Trump saying that we should end the war? You mean that kind of thing? I don't know what they mean by that. I really don't know. They better not be setting us up for a false flag.
Yeah.
Just to use our own equipment on us. You know what I mean?
Well, we're going to rearm them, and then what? They're going to sell half of it again?
Yeah. But the emergence of a joint ceasefire proposal from the United States and Ukraine complicates things for Mr. Putin. It deepens the tension between his desires for a far-reaching victory in Ukraine and for close ties with Mr. Trump. Oh, wait a minute. I thought it was Trump that was buddying up to, but now the New York Times is saying that it's Putin who wants to make sure he stays on the good side of Trump. I thought it was the other way. I thought it was backwards. I thought it was Trump trying to make sure he stayed on the good side of Putin. But the New York Times is now saying it's the exact opposite. Isn't that weird?
Oh, maybe he gave him the P-tape back, and that's why.
They've been pushing propaganda.
They are going to proceed with joining AAA in case they need roadside assistance, though. While Mr. Putin says he wants to end the war as soon as possible, Putin has signaled he will not stop fighting until he extracts major concessions from the West and from Kiev, including a pledge that Ukraine will not join NATO and that the alliance will reduce its presence in Central and Eastern Europe. That makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense. What's in it for him?
Oh, just another point here. It's the Ukraine. You know how they say it's not
That's
the
right.
Ukraine, it's Ukraine?
No.
It means the borderland. So it's that's some lie they made up.
Yep.
They're trying to push this bullshit. The Ukraine.
The Ukraine.
Kiev.
It's Kiev. It's the Ukraine. On January 20th, when he congratulated Mr. Trump on his inauguration, Putin made clear that the goal of any Ukraine talks must not be a short ceasefire, not some kind of respite. Russia, he said, sought a long-term peace based on respect for the legitimate interests of all people, all nations who live in the region. Analysts say Putin's opposition to a temporary ceasefire stemmed from the simple calculation that with Russian forces gaining on the battlefield, Moscow would only give up its leverage by stopping the fighting without winning concessions. So they're not going to, why would he give that? So why would Putin want to do this? Why would he want to do that when Putin's on the march, they're winning, and Ukraine's losing? And why wouldn't
he still wants to talk to Trump? So what is that? What does that mean? A secret plan? Why does everything have to be a secret?
So Ukraine set to lose Kursk pocket its foothold inside Russia. So they're on their way to losing. February 12th phone call between Putin and Trump and the White House subsequent alignment with Russia and the United Nations and elsewhere may have affected Putin's calculus by making him more eager to stay on Mr. Trump's good side. Analysts say, I thought Trump was just Putin's lackey and does whatever he says, but apparently it's Putin who wants to stay on Trump's good side. Isn't that weird?
Wait, I thought Elon was in charge of all of them.
Yeah. Isn't that this is the New York Times saying this? So they've been telling me for 8 years that Trump is Putin's lackey, and now all of a sudden they're telling me that Putin is eager to stay on Trump's good side.
Hey, did Israel tell the New York Times to write that as a reward for Trump being a good boy?
I wonder. A political analyst in Moscow said the Kremlin could be tempted to accept a truce that would be tactically unfavorable, but strategically favorable in order to show that it's a peacemaker. In another sign of Moscow's charm offensive directed at the Trump camp, Russia's foreign ministry released a 90-minute interview on Wednesday that the foreign minister Lavrov gave to 3 American video bloggers, including the former Fox News personality Andrew Napolitano. I was invited to that. Couldn't go. Mr. Lavrov, speaking English, praised the Trump administration for reversing the Democrats' departure from Christian values and said Russia was ready for the normal relations that the United States was offering. How could they have a charm offensive and not invite Martha Stewart? Mr. Putin's calculus could also be affected by Russia's progress in recent days in pushing Ukrainian troops out of Kursk, the Russian border region where Ukraine occupied several hundred square miles of territory in a surprise incursion last August. Mr. Zelensky said he had planned to use that land as a bargaining chip in future talks, but the Kremlin signaled that it would refuse to negotiate so long as Ukraine held that territory. With the Kursk region mostly back in Russian hands, Putin no longer risks losing face by agreeing to a ceasefire that would leave Ukraine in control of the swath of Russian territory. Ukraine launches so here's the thing. Ukraine launches massive. So what is the date on this? March 11th. Ukraine launches massive drone strike on Moscow ahead of U.S. peace talks.
Is it massive? Because it looks like something splattered on the side of a building, and that's about it.
It's not Kid Rock's hotel room. That is the resounding boom of the war industry trying to impede any effort towards peace. That's what that is. That's what that is. Trump. So Danny Haifong tweets out, Trump and his team just announced a farcical ceasefire with Ukraine, and all the warmongers are falling into line. The ball is not in Russia's court. The U.S. is the root cause of the conflict to start with. Ukraine was attacking Moscow and killing innocents in Kursk during these farcical talks. So while they're having these peace talks, they're actually bombing Moscow. Who was Ukraine? The U.S. hasn't negotiated in good faith. In fact, it has yet to offer one concession despite being defeated by Russia. The U.S.'s warmongering elite can't be trusted ever, says Danny Haifong. So here's Ursula von der Leyen. The ball is now in Russia's court. Emmanuel Macron. The ball is clearly in Russia's court. That's asshole. The ball is always in Russia's court. Secretary Marcos. The ball is now in Russia's court.
Great.
I think the ball gag is in. When are you guys going to figure out, when you get the memo, put it in your own words? They just use the same phrase. Balls. They get the memo and then they just repeat it. The ball's in your court, in Russia's court.
Same nonsense.
Yeah.
So
I think there's balls in Rubio's mouth.
So I agree. So the point is, it's really in United States and Ukraine. They're the ones who provoked this war. They're the one who is bombing Moscow as they're trying to do peace talks. Anyway, okay, over to so it's weird. Trump is going to start arming Ukraine again. That's also weird, but that's just a giveaway to the military-industrial complex. That's all that is. That's okay. I'm gonna do my corruption. That's just corruption. That's all that is.
Well,
because we know that
assurances that it would be spent in Israel like he intended.
Right. So of course they're going to take that, and we know that they've been at least half the stuff we sent them they're reselling on the black market. Come see us on tour in Baltimore.
Outcome is, but they have very serious discussions going on right now with President Putin and others, and hopefully they all want to end this nightmare. It's a nightmare. It's a horrible thing when you look.
Okay, so that was from the White House. That was literally just minutes ago before we came on the air here. President Trump went on the air and said that his negotiating teams are in Russia. They're communicating with them. That Putin, he says, has conceptually agreed, I think in principle is the term they used, to a 30-day ceasefire, but the devil's in the details, as we've said. Now, we've been showing you for months how Russia has been adamant that there wouldn't be a ceasefire, that they're willing to negotiate, but they're not going to do a ceasefire because they said that would only benefit the Ukraine side. But they wanted a long-term end to this. They wanted to negotiate while still fighting, and that's what they were willing to do. Yesterday, in fact, you see that on the screen right there, Putin in fatigues. We're going to talk about that more in a little bit here. I think the first time we've seen him in military uniform since the war started. So that's kind of noteworthy by itself. But he was down there talking with Valery Gerasimov, who is the chief of staff of the armed forces of Russia, in near the Kursk area, and we'll talk about what's been going on there as well. But he said a number of things in that conversation yesterday. But before I get to what he said yesterday, I want to get to what he said earlier today. He had a press conference with the leader of Belarus, Lukashenko, and in it he was asked specifically about this request for a 30-day ceasefire.
We understand that there are activities aimed at reducing loss of human life in the conflict. Secondly, we agree with the proposals for the ceasefire, but our position is based on the assumption that the ceasefire would lead to a long-term peace, something that would remove the initial reasons for the crisis.
So there's some big caveats. The way it's being shown in the Russian press is he agrees to the concept of a 30-day ceasefire, quote, with nuances, end quote. We keep hearing that a lot. And then the question are, what are those nuances? Some of which he mentioned right there, which is the root causes have to be addressed. That mirrors what Sergei Lavrov has continuously said. We showed a clip of him yesterday saying that from back in December. They've said nothing besides that it has to be something that eliminates the war, not just stops the fighting. That's something that Russia said they were not interested in. And that is potentially telling, because for the Russian side, what has caused the war, the roots of this conflict, go back to NATO trying to come into Europe. NATO trying to come into Ukraine, the ability for the Ukraine side to have a large military, and of course, having all of that right up on the Russian border. And that's one of the things they were completely against. And of course, going back even to the Minsk agreements before that, it was the effective civil war that had been going on in Ukraine since 2014, which included a lot of ethnic Russians and Russian speakers that the Russian side had been supporting for the whole thing. So to them, all of that has to get resolved. That has to be part of this. Now, what is not clear, what he didn't say in that interview was, does that have to happen before there can be this 30-day ceasefire? Or does he say, well, that has to be the end? Because if you just say that, well, all right, sure, we'll address the root causes, let's stop the fighting today for 30 days and start talking about that, because then that's going to say, well, then they may not get to it. I mean, the two sides are miles apart as it is on the root causes, and there's not any agreement at all on any of the sides, whether that's U.S., Ukraine, or the European side and the Russian side. There's no agreement at all on that. So it seems suspiciously unlikely that Russia would go down that path of just saying, yeah, without closing that gap first, we're going to have a negotiated peace. Because you can just say, sure, we'll address the core issues. If the West thinks that the core issues are over here and Russia thinks the core issues are over here, then you see that you're not even close to having a resolution. So one would imagine that Russia would want some kind of assurances that they were maybe this far away, not this far away, or they may not agree to the resolution. I know many people in the Russian press, I've been reading this earlier today to kind of see what the reaction to a lot of this is. They seem to be convinced, they're not, quote, worried that Putin may give things away. They're actually confident that what he's saying is, we're not going to reach a ceasefire unless you be according to the terms that we have set. They said that militarily, Russia is in a position that they have now shown dramatic advances in the Kursk area, especially since the 8th of March, really. They went on this huge run, and they're almost completely have driven Ukraine out of Russian territory. And that's where Putin was when he was in that camouflage uniform yesterday, talking with Gerasimov near the front lines. The people in Russia and the state-approved media, I'm not just talking about telegrams, but in the state-approved media, they are saying, hey, this is just us telling the West what it's going to be. And yeah, we'll have a ceasefire as long as you agree to all of our terms. And that's going to be the demilitarization of Ukraine and the denazification of Ukraine. Those are two super important parts, aside from the physical territory, aside from the June 14 lines I've mentioned several times before, the administrative borders of those areas. They were saying that the Ukraine side must willingly to lay down its arms and withdraw from all the territories before there would be a ceasefire. And specifically in the area of the Kursk, the Russian side is saying you have a simple choice, two choices for all the Ukraine side in there, surrender or die. That's one of the things that's actually coming out of the Kremlin today as well. I think that came directly from Putin. I believe that was actually one of his quotes, not something they're assuming. And so they don't appear, the Russian side doesn't appear at all interested in having a ceasefire when they're literally about to finally close the gap in the Kursk area. And that was actually one of the things also mentioned by Putin in his discussions today was, what about that situation there? Because we're not going to end the fighting and leave that open in, to have allowed them to enter our territory, and then right at the end when we're getting ready to close it off, to somehow have them escape. Because one of the other things from the comment yesterday, I want to go ahead and talk about this, that Putin said, this whole issue about the fighters in Kursk, we view them in Russian law, which is a little different than the Geneva Convention.
I very much expect that all combat tasks of our units will certainly be fulfilled, and the territory of the Kursk region will soon be completely liberated from the enemy. Our task in the near future, as soon as possible, is to completely defeat the enemy, who is entrenched and still fighting on the territory of the Kursk region, to completely liberate the territory of the Kursk region and restore the situation on the state border. And, of course, I ask you to consider the creation of a security zone along the state border in the future. I would also like to draw attention to this. All those who are on the territory of the Kursk region, who are committing crimes against the civilian population here, who are opposing our armed forces, law enforcement agencies and special services, are terrorists according to the laws of the Russian Federation. Now Valery Vasilevich Gerasimov has just mentioned the prisoners of war. But these people, of course, must be treated first and foremost as terrorists, in accordance with the laws of the Russian Federation.
Now, of course, everybody in the West remembers in the first year of the war when they were trying to negotiate the terms of an end of the fighting in Istanbul in late March, early April of 2022, that there was this, shortly after those meetings had adjourned, there was an explosion in the Western media about what they claimed was the discovery of a massacre in a place called Bucha. And the claim was that the Russian soldiers had massacred and executed a lot of civilians, and that just hardened the resolve of the West. It infuriated it, made everybody really angry, and said, you know, what barbaric people the Russians are, etc. So for no way we're going to talk about peace. Forget it. That's not going to happen. We're going to go on until we have victory over the Russians. You may remember that. Now, there's a lot of dispute. The people in the West will say it's been verified, it's been validated. It was war crimes by the Russians. But there are other versions on the other side, and certainly on the Russian side, they believe that it was staged, etc. I'm not going to try to litigate that now. I don't have any firsthand experience. I can't tell you other than that there are two really different viewpoints about what actually happened there. But what I can tell you is that on the Russian side here, then hardly anybody in the West talks about this, and they have not been putting the news out there, though it has been all over the place in the Russian media and especially in the Telegram channels, is that the Russians say that there has been widespread war crimes by the Ukraine side in the Kursk region against their civilian population. And there are a lot of videos that have been out there, a lot of photographs that have been put in there where they say that a lot of old people have been executed, they were tortured, that people were summarily killed. They were just executed civilians, I'm talking about, throughout the Kursk region. Now, like the deal with Bucha, I'm not in a position to be able to say what's true or what's not. What I can tell you is that the Russians believe that it is true. And so that is the reason why Putin was so emphatic to say in that press conference that he is not going to just treat them as prisoners of war under the normal Geneva Conventions, because in his mind, they came onto the territory of Russians and attacked civilian people. Ergo, by their definitions, that is terrorism, and therefore they will be treated as terrorists. Now, that's a big issue because the people of Russia are not going to be very disposed to have a peace settlement that's beneficial to the Ukraine side when they see that their civilian people were massacred, they believe, by the Ukraine side. Now, that is going to be factoring into any kind of an agreement to have a ceasefire, because one of the a couple of other things that they're saying is that this ceasefire, one of the questions that Putin had in his press conference today was, he says, before we'll agree to this, we need to see from our American colleagues, and you heard Trump say a second ago that our representatives are there. I believe it's Steve Witkoff. I think he's actually on the ground in Moscow, if I'm not mistaken, right now. But there's definitely conversations going on. And one of the things the Russian side said, before we agree to this, we want to know how is it going to be monitored? Because the big problem that the Russians have with all this is they say, listen, we're advancing on every front. in the Kursk area. There's still active operations going on north of Kharkiv, and then all along the area, especially in the Kupiansk area, the Toretsk area, and then southern, even in the Kherson area. A lot of operations going on there. Russia, in their view, is advancing on nearly every front. So they're saying, where's the benefit to us to have a ceasefire right now when we're already on the way up? We don't want a ceasefire that's going to result in the other side being able to recuperate, to replace their losses, to continue digging defensive lines. So apparently one of the caveats, the nuances that the Russian side referred to, is that there will be a complete and total freeze of all activity everywhere, so that the Ukraine side will not be allowed to move any ammunition in. They will not be able to resupply stocks. They will not be able to move more people up and to move troops around to reinforce anything like that. It has to be a complete and a total freeze. Now, whether the Russian side will abide by that on their end remains to be seen. But that's one of the things that Putin is saying that they need to have resolved. He said, and how will we validate that these things are going on? Now, one of the things we hear oftentimes in the West is that, well, we can't trust Putin. We can never trust anything he says. But we forget that the same lack of trust exists on the Russian side, because from their perspective, that the West has often broken its word to it, that they have often said one thing and then done something different. So they also are saying, how can we trust the West side? And so Putin was asking, there's going to have to be some sort of validation instrument as part of all this, so that we can validate that Ukraine is not doing the things that we say they can't do if we agree to a truce. Now, that's something that's going to be very complicated, and I don't know how that's going to be resolved anytime soon. And all evidence is that the Russians are going to continue on with their offensive operations. That's one thing that the Russians have said a long time, that the reason why they didn't want a truce was because they wanted to continue fighting, because they wanted to continue going on until there was, an issue that brought to the conclusion the core issues of this, the root causes. And so they said, we're not in any mood to actually stop fighting because we're on the military advantage. And as I've said a whole bunch of times, why would the side that has the power, that has the combat advantage, and therefore can compel and has the diplomatic leverage to impose upon the other side, why would they willingly set that aside? I don't know. Maybe there's some sweeteners that the Trump administration can do. The Witkoff's there. Who knows? Maybe he's saying, okay, I know militarily it's not in your advantage to have a ceasefire, but if we can give you some sweeteners, some of which have been kicked around as possibilities, is all right, we will release some of the money, the frozen assets of the Russians that are in Western banks. We'll remove some of the sanctions that are against Russia in exchange for a ceasefire. We need to understand something. It is possible that there's a ceasefire, even though militarily there's no reason the Russians would do it. But if there can be some sweeteners added, it could be made to be in the interest of the Russian side to do this. I certainly hope that's the case. I'm a big advocate of that. Anything that stops the killing on all sides of this is something I'm super in favor of. But we also have to be sober-minded and understand this won't be cost-free. And the idea that Trump could remove some of the sanctions on Russia, that he could remove some or free up some of the frozen assets, will just explode the heads of many in Europe, because they don't want to give anything. They want to get a ceasefire that benefits the Ukraine side, that disadvantages the Russian side, and they want to pay nothing for it. That's almost certainly not going to happen. There's no rational reason why the Russians would do that, when, as they say, they can just ignore the whole thing. They don't have to have a deal. They don't have to have a negotiated settlement. They can just continue the war as is, even if they keep going it slow, even if they don't use any of these so-called big arrow movements where they have a shock and awe kind of a deal like the U.S. has used before, like the Russians did on the first iteration of this war in February of 2022. They haven't done any of those since. Now, I've long been puzzled why they haven't, because according to all we can see, they have the combat power that's not in contact, and they could do it. Thus far, they have chosen not to for their reasons. One of the reasons the Russian side, especially on some of their military channels, is that the Russian headquarters has said they are prioritizing lowering the offensive casualties for the Russian side. And if they calculate, if they go slow, that they can inflict a significant number of casualties on the Ukraine side. And over time, even if it takes another year of combat, they think that they will eventually grind the Ukrainian army to dust, and then they'll just simply take over the rest, because there won't be anybody left to defend it. I don't know if that's going to happen or not, but given what has happened here, there has been a substantial reduction in the effectiveness and the size of the Ukrainian army. So there's certainly some evidence that that is working, even though it's not the Western way, and we certainly wouldn't do it that way. But they prioritize the destruction of the Ukrainian army above taking territory because they calculate they want to minimize their own casualties. And then eventually, by focusing on the force structure, they'll eventually get all the territory anyway without even having to fight for it after that happens. That's their philosophy. We'll see how that plays out. But whether we like it or not, whether we agree with it or not, that is what they are attempting to do. So now you get to the issue of a ceasefire. Is Russia going to have a ceasefire that's going to lead to a negotiated settlement that's going to be less than Putin's June 14 lines? That seems really unlikely. So again, we get to the cost of him agreeing to this. Putin has said he is willing to do this. But aside from these sweeteners that I just mentioned here, it's also going to have to be, apparently, based on what he said, that the West side is going to have to agree that all of the June 14 lines are going to be committed. That means that there's going to be an election in Ukraine because they won't sign. They've clearly said that, and they haven't changed this at all. They won't sign a final deal unless they have what they consider to be a valid president, somebody who has stood forward and won an election, and they don't see Zelensky's doing that. Zelensky still, to this day, still has a law prohibiting him from negotiating with anything with Russia. So that would have to change as well. They have also said, and this was in the Institute for the Study of War reported in December, late December, I think it was the 24th, that there was the Russian side at their Duma level, their parliament, had said, listen, we're going to hold something like what was the term they used? Istanbul 2022 plus scenario, meaning that the terms we had there will all be in effect plus some more. And one of the key ones expressly mentioned was the demilitarization of whatever's left in Ukraine, which they calculated at a number of 85,000. That's where that number came from. It was from a Russian Duma person reported by the Institute for the Study of War, going back to the 24th of December of last year. Yeah, that's the one right there that's in there. And you can scroll up and you can probably see that one. So that we've not seen anything that would repudiate that. And so Russia would have to have some real big reason to say we're going to go back from that. And listen, again, you have to understand the people in Russia believe they have paid a huge and unnecessary price to have won these things. Now they see they are on the military irrevocable advantage. And if they didn't do any deal at all, if they didn't do any ceasefire at all, then they're eventually going to be able to win at a cost that they can afford, or that they're willing to pay, rather. And they see that the Ukraine side isn't. Now, if they have a chance through negotiations to accomplish their security objectives and not lose any more troops, then they would do that as well. But therein gets to the point, and this is what we don't know. And so far, no one's given us enough information we can see from here. What would the West and Ukraine have to agree to in order for Putin to say, all right, that satisfies my minimum conditions, I will go ahead and agree to a 30-day ceasefire given these conditions? Because it seems likely that those conditions would have to be some kind of public agreement that, yes, it's going to be something close to the June 14 lines. It's going to be all the administrative. There will be an election, and it's going to have to be a demilitarization. The end result is going to be this. If the West doesn't agree to that, then it's really hard for me to understand how they would ever agree to a ceasefire where that's left up in the open, because then the likelihood is that the Ukraine side will do exactly what Putin has feared, which is to rest up and recuperate. And believe me, they need this in the worst way. There's many fighters, not common knowledge in the West, on the Ukraine side that have never had a break. Some of them have actually been fighting since the war started. And many others, as time has gone on and they've been mobilized and they've been put in there, also have not had a break. Obviously, the casualties are monstrous. But some of those who have survived have never had a break, which is, you just cannot imagine the emotional and the moral turmoil that puts on the mind. And they are in desperate need of a relaxation because Russia hasn't given them one anywhere all along the line of contact here. And if Russia is going to remove that pressure, it seems very likely that they're going to have a big give on the Western side before they agree to do that, because that is a huge issue. I saw the other day that Sebastian Gorka said that anytime there's a ceasefire or a negotiated end, you have to first have a ceasefire. Well, that's definitely not true, because we have seen. I mean, just look at the Korean War, for example. I think it was like a year and a half of negotiations before we finally came to the armistice, and there was fighting every single day. It was huge casualties back and forth all along what was then the line of contact. So that's very much something that has happened in the past. And then look at World War II. There was no truce there. There was no ceasefire to negotiate an end. There was just one side militarily defeating the other. And we have to understand that Russia is in the driver's seat. And if they want to press a hard bargain and drive a hard bargain and say, we're not going to submit on these things here and these conditions to even have a ceasefire, they don't have to. Now, I hope Trump is able to get this done. I hope that with his negotiating team, with any kind of other sweeteners he may offer, I absolutely wish them every luck in the world, because that would be great for the people of Ukraine. It would be great for everybody. It would end the killing and give us a chance to have a durable peace. But listen, even if you get a 30-day ceasefire, Russia is not going to agree to something short of their minimum lines. I don't think Putin would be able to stay in power if he agreed to even freezing the conflict along the current line of contact, because that would leave Russian citizens that are, by their constitution, already Russian citizens that are still on the other side of the Ukraine line, and they would not abandon them. That is like a sacrosanct thing for the Russians. They really do believe in what they're saying here about the taking care of the Russian people. There are still what they consider Russian people on the Ukraine side of the line. And I don't see any evidence and don't believe at all that Russia would agree to any kind of a line that leaves what they consider Russians on the Ukraine side of this. And the other, maybe the biggest issue is this demilitarization issue, and definitely the denazification / need for elections. I just don't see Russia giving in on either one of those two things, because they don't have to. I mean, just imagine, what sense would it make for Russia to have done all they have to have the advantage they have right now, that if they fight even another 9, 10, 12 months, even if they had to fight another 12 months, they could set the pace for the indefinite history, an indefinite future rather, of security based on their own terms, without having to trust anybody, without having to have a negotiated settlement. They can have that for the security of their country, even if they had to spend another year to do that, as opposed to having a deal that doesn't require the Zelensky government to get out, that doesn't require a demilitarization, and does leave open the possibility of the Western Europe making good on what you saw in our previous show today. Ursula von der Leyen is having a rearmed situation where they want all of Europe to grow stronger, and they want a good portion of that to all go into Ukraine. Those things are mutually incompatible. They cannot both exist. Russia will not have security as it deems necessary if all of those things are not solved. So even if you get a ceasefire, which will be hard, that still is just a 30-day ceasefire. It's not an end of conflict. And if Russia doesn't get its way, there's every reason to think that they may continue on. And listen, Russia would also benefit from a ceasefire. So there's also could be that. Their men could certainly stop dying for 30 days. They could rearm and refit and whatever else, depending on the terms of it. But even if it was just a mutually restrictive situation where nobody could reinforce anything, their troops would benefit from a 30-day respite as well. So it wouldn't be out. But they're not going to seek respite for their troops and a benefit for their men at the expense of the ultimate objective. Putin was very clear on that today. He's been very clear on that from day one, and it's never changed about the ultimate outcomes of these situations here. It doesn't seem to be that the West is getting the message, though. I referenced our earlier show today where you had Ursula von der Leyen said, they're on this rearm situation and they're on a military buildup. Go back and watch that show. I won't relitigate it right now, but the bottom line is they're giving Russia every reason in the world not to trust us, not to want to have a negotiated settlement that leaves a rearming Europe on their doorstep. That almost certainly means that they're going to continue the military buildup they've been on for the last couple of years, especially. So that's not going to help long-term peace anyway. But some in the West, as illustrated here by former CIA director and former SecDev Leon Panetta, has different views.
I've learned after many years of dealing with Putin, both as director of the CIA and Secretary of Defense, that you never can trust Putin, and that Putin is not somebody who responds to pretty please. He usually responds to force. And the result is that I really am concerned whether or not Putin will respond positively to the approach of agreeing to some kind of ceasefire. I think the only way he's going to do that is if he is convinced that there is no way for him to win this war. And the only way to convince him is to have the United States strongly back Ukraine in its efforts to defend itself.
That is alarming to me, especially that last part. First of all, let me back up to a little earlier in his comment there. He says, Putin typically only responds to force. Really? Is that what the play you want to make, that Putin can be compelled to something? Where have you seen Russia respond to force? Where have you seen that the West has pressured Russia and that they've done something according to what we want there, that he backed down? Where have you seen that? Because other than when Russia was weak at the beginning, when NATO was expanding and Russia didn't have the capacity to stand up, and for example, the Baltics, when they were brought into Russia, into NATO, the Russians were opposed to that. They didn't like it, but they didn't have any power to do anything. So now, if you think that that's the template, that's what you mean when you say Russia or Putin specifically responds to force, he didn't have the capacity to do anything then, and that was still on his periphery. Even though it was on his border, there is the Suwalki Gap, a very small territory of land that Russia realizes that they could block in the event that anybody went into hostilities, and it could bottleneck everything. And so it's not that big of a threat. But Ukraine, on the other hand, in NATO would have been a huge issue here. And we had 15 years prior to this war to where we kept trying to press Putin. We kept trying to push him. And he finally said, yeah, I ain't having that anymore. We pushed him too hard in Georgia in 2008. He took action there. Then we pushed too hard in Ukraine all the way, despite all of their protestations in Russia, despite all of his, practically begging to follow the Minsk and then having another negotiated settlement right before. He didn't respond to any of that. So then we say we were going to press up anyway, and he reacted. Now then, they're much stronger even than they were in 2022. And you want to make the argument, former CIA director, former Secretary of Defense, with all your credibility, you want to say that now that Putin can be forced into it? I mean, that's one thing that's bad enough. But then you say toward the end there that we're going to, change the power dynamic so that Russia understands that it can't win. Goodness gracious, you've got to be kidding me. Were you asleep in the year of 2023? Have you slept through the entire 2024 on top of that? Have you not seen the daily reports? Have you not seen the casualty figures on the Ukraine side? Do you not realize that the industrial capacity on the Russian side and on the entire Western side are grossly out of balance and growing in the Russian side to this day? We can't fight an attrition war like that and win. You see, the European side is saying they want this rearm thing, $800 billion, huge number, but spread out over many years, and that'll be a long time in coming. Oblivious to the fact that the Russians are already ahead, and they're definitely not going to just sit passively by. They'll continue to build up, and they'll still have an advantage even in 2030. God forbid if there's any war that could come between them. There's not. The power dynamics are still not in our favor. How can he not get these kinds of things? This is not hard to figure out. If you want peace in Europe, if you want peace between Russia and what's left of Ukraine, if you want to lower the threat of armed conflict and definitely nuclear escalation with Europe and interest in the American side, then you want to de-escalate the situation. No one is even talking about the possibility, other than Donald Trump, of having a negotiated an end. He's the only guy that's actually looking beyond the war to try to improve relations. He's actually seeking negotiated settlement on the nuclear issue to try and lower that temperature there. He wants to get war off the table so that he can begin recovering and having normalized relations that benefit everyone and lower anybody's need to have a conflict in the future. That's the only thing that we should go towards. And yet you have guys like this. You have, of course, Starmer, Macron, Ursula von der Leyen, Kaja Kallas. All of these people keep talking about ways they'll only want to solve things with more force, even though there is a huge, we'll just take the last 24 months of wreckage of these attempts to try and change that on the ground. And it has done nothing but make Europe weaker, has destroyed Ukraine and made Russia stronger. What do you not get about this? That's not hard to figure out. And yet you're oblivious to this, and you still advocate for doing the same things that failed in the first 3 years of this war. You just want to do more of it. And there's no rational path to get there. I'm grateful that that guy is no longer in office, but, you know, holy cow, they keep putting in the microphone in his face and people keep listening to him. But they don't look at what he's actually happened and what he's suggesting, because it's irrational what he is suggesting. But that's the state of play today. So we'll have to continue monitoring this and be real interested in hearing what comes, what is ever announced after these next level of meetings, because it's going to be really important. Some have suggested they have hopes that this thing could possibly, this 30-day ceasefire could be implemented as soon as a week from now. Obviously, we give our supreme hopes for that. But the devil's in the details. It's going to remain so. It's going to be a heavy lift. So I don't want to get anybody's hopes up that's going to happen, even though we're fully advocating it. But listen, until those issues get resolved, we have to be prepared that Russia may either demand some sweeteners that are beyond what Trump is willing to give, or that his conditions to even start this, which is probably some kind of declaration of demilitarization and a denazification, as they define it, are probably going to be necessary up front, or they're not going to stop fighting. They don't have to. We'll have to see how that goes on. We will definitely stay on top of this for you. We will bring you information as it happens.
Kofi, follow me.